A Quick and Dirty Guide to Psychoanalysis. By Pseudoanalysis. Entry 1, Purpose and Introductory Ramblings. A. This blog will correct misconceived polemics regarding psychoanalytic theory, concepts, and technique. Clarify unintentional mistakes about psychoanalytic theory, concepts, and technique. Map the above onto real, lived experience without deprecating the nature of the thought ramble and roam. B. This blog will not proceed chronologically/alphabetically/genealogically, but will proceed by my own desire. Use citations, but will include names of thinkers and texts. Be exceptionally in-depth, critical, or in any way exhaustive. C. This blog is for people who want to learn more about psychoanalysis in general. People who want to challenge their already critical notions of psychoanalysis. People who want to get an idea of the way psychoanalysis critiques itself. No one has to have any pre-knowledge of any philosophy, psychology, or psychoanalysis. D. This blog was made because I read many books from all fields and publishers, but mainly books published by Semiotext, Repeater, Verso, University of Minnesota Press, and Urbanomic. These publishers and the series they produce, Forerunners First Ideas, Theory Out of Bounds, Intervention Series, Foreign Agents, Redactions, Collected Writings, etc., as well as the consistency of intertextuality and self-referentiality that is unintentionally produced between these series and publishing houses, tends to create a broad-stroke narrative of psychoanalysis as 1. Some archaic practice terribly disconnected from any worthwhile thought. 2. A solely Lacanian or hardline Freudian affair. 3. A leftist theoretical apparatus for leveraging a revolution and performing critique. And this narrative needs to be, as mentioned in A and C, corrected, clarified, and challenged. What is psychoanalysis? A critical theory of mind, epistemological, and a technique of working with people, methodological, to reduce dystonic symptoms, things the patient or analysand identifies in themselves as not liking and wanting to learn more about, while helping people develop dynamic tools to interface with life and its demands as they arise, not necessarily the commonplace critique that psychoanalysis simply prepares people to better function within a hegemonic society, or be better capitalist, etc. Psychoanalysis, despite it being the object of attack from Marxists, should please Marxists considering it is one of the few fields in which the theory and praxis are directly connected, but more on this later. For now, the approach of psychoanalysis actually lies somewhere between the left's positive idea of psychoanalysis, that the analyst helps the analysand become a critical anti-capitalist force in society, and the left's negative idea of psychoanalysis, that, with its emphasis on money and representation, it not only fails to produce revolutionary potential but in fact suppresses, or oppresses, revolutionary potential by reducing polyvocality, many voices, having many ideas, many associations, many meanings, to one static symbol. You say you want to become a better writer, but it seems to me your interest in maintaining control of the pen is really an interest in controlling the power of the penis and daily retaining and purifying your work in an obsessional manner, blah blah blah. Contemporary psychoanalysis always sees things on multiple registers. See Bussey's referential model. The patient wishes to learn to write better. What is it that keeps them from being what they want to be? Could this also be a surface manifestation of a deeper feeling of inadequacy? Could inadequacy be related to early childhood experiences as much as it is related to here and now social situations? The answer is more often than not yes on all accounts. Psychoanalysis endorses affirmation, not negation. On a different note, very simply, psychoanalysis aims, not unlike Nietzschean philosophy, at helping the analysand unpack what is their value or voice and what is a value or voice that they have inherited from someone or something else without question. In this way, psychoanalysis helps people create values that match their lived experiences. My own example: as a child my father would repeatedly bash 80s music. Thus, I grew up with the notion that 80s music was low quality, low talent, and insincere due to its use of synthetic instruments, drummed machines, keyboards, etc. As I began to undergo analysis myself, I was able to begin to question this value, and in time I found that I quite enjoyed a large portion of 80s music. This was my father's value that had no real lived connection to my own experiences. Upon realizing I liked 80s music, I retrospectively discovered that I had secretly enjoyed many 80s hits as a child, but had hidden it from my father, or used irony to distance myself from a true enjoyment. The same idea on a more serious level: I was raised as a bleeding heart liberal. At some point in my graduate career, watching a rerun of Stephen Colbert's political show, I had the thought, this isn't funny, it's just a disingenuous straw man of the right's attempt at making sense of their world. At this point I began questioning my dogmatic leftism and am currently in some uncharted territory of political ambiguity. More concretely, psychoanalysis, broken down, or analyzed, into the basic words, means the analysis of psychic contents. To analyze simply means to break down into parts, or to follow a line of thinking back from a larger item, macro or molar, reified or ossified, to two or more smaller items. Psychic contents simply means the stuff that appears or is experienced as internal. Internal, external is a dichotomy important to psychoanalysis, as we will see later when exploring the major theorists. Despite the fact that internal and the external are hotly debated concepts outside the psychoanalytic milieu, starting with Kant and his transcendental critique, which roots things like space, time, order, synthesis, etc. as internal functions of varying interacting faculties and categories, to later topics of debate between sociology and psychology and the limits each field of study was willing to admit to or polemically assign to the other, to much later works like that of Deleuze and Guattari, who worked to dissolve the hard and fast difference between the inside and the outside. A trajectory they take up following Freud's description in Beyond the Pleasure Principle of a primitive organism and its development from inanimate surface tension in inorganic matter to a soft inner space that develops a crust as to defend against overwhelming tension states, thus forming an inside and an outside. To most recently the work of thinkers like Mark Fisher, Nick Land, Robin McKay, who, in synthesizing many of the thinkers who came before them, emphasize the importance of thinking in terms of impersonal flows of energy on non-mystical, cosmological and geological scales. If this was confusing, do not fret. We will expand on this at a later date. Tune in for tomorrow's post, where I will clarify some of what was said here as well as introduce some new material. Entry 2, some collected notes on transference, neurosis, internal objects, and repetition compulsion. Psychoanalysis starts in the late 1800s with Freud and Breuer's study of hysteric women. With hysterics, and we don't have to put stock into the term, but simply have to use heuristically for the time being, it quickly becomes evident that the symptomology cannot be reduced to medical explanations or illnesses. F&B surmise, so, if medical treatment is either inappropriate, or due to there being no medical ailment, useless, perhaps we should investigate the patient's understanding of their experiences and see what can be learned. Through talking, some symptoms seem to cease or become reduced. Thus, the talking cure is born. Next, with these women, Freud and Breuer begin to experience something they will later conceptualize as transference, i.e. when the patient assumes certain facts about the doctor and has certain feelings about these assumed facts that do not seem to arise from having spent time or having gotten to know the doctor. These are the experiences of the patient being aroused through association and then projected upon the doctor. This happens daily in all our lives. We get a warm feeling from someone who we have never met, who may not have done something particularly warm, and, upon reflection, see that they remind us of a loved one. A co-worker of mine, younger, seems to have fond platonic feelings for me very quickly. We hit it off with ease and maintain a good friendship despite no longer working similar shifts together. It turns out this co-worker has an older brother about the same age as me whom the co-worker is in good standing with. The co-worker has had positive relations with an older male which has seemingly transferred to our work relationship. On transference, to be brief, Freud's oeuvre can be summed up as you are not having a reaction to me here in the moment, you are reacting to an event or person from your past. For psychoanalysis, the present is dictated by a model consisting of dynamically interacting internal objects unconsciously predicated and developed on rigidified and ossified experiences of the past. I have had a good experience with my older brother, so if a co-worker reminds me of an older brother via association, I am likely to lean towards having a positive relationship. The concept was originally termed transference neurosis by Jung. Like Freud, Jung's oeuvre was something like if one is introverted, one should learn to be more extroverted, if one is extroverted, one should learn to be more introverted. Thus, one should be omniverted. That is, for psychoanalysis, ultimately one should be able to call upon the appropriate tools, ideas, thoughts and feelings, to deal with whatever situation is at hand. Dynamism and active position over stasis and reaction. Similarly, neurosis, when it appears as a concept separate from transference neurosis, is essentially a response to an event that is not necessarily appropriate to the event, or more accurately, a limited response in relation to a previously psychically solidified context, an internal object, rather than a present reality. In other words, it is reactionary, responding to a stale stereotype from the past. For example, a patient of mine has social anxiety despite being in a safe environment full of friendly people. He cannot help but avoid social exchanges, and when confronted with a stranger's outreached handshake gesture, seizes up or begins to sweat profusely. This patient has only a few tools to deal with the situation at hand. Tools build on past experiences, or imagined experiences, which we will cover when we get into drive theory. After psychoanalysis with myself, where the patient is exposed to the possibility of new ideas, thoughts, and feelings through a variety of different interventions, the patient can pull from a wider reservoir of possible responses previously unthought or foreclosed. I reiterate, the neurotic is reactionary. Earlier traumas from the there and then are compulsively repeated and enacted in response to a variety of otherwise non-traumatic stimuli in the here and now. Freud's repetition compulsion, whereas the analyzed patient may muster the appropriate tools to respond to the situation at hand. What is an internal object, you ask? Freud develops the concept, but it is Melanie Klein who really runs with it. We will get to that later. For now we will relate the idea of an internal object to the discussion of voice. Value form entry 1. Here is how I sometimes explain this to my patients, when they are interested and ready to hear it in a way that is both intellectually and emotionally relevant to their treatment. As a little baby, one has the impulse to do as they please. Pick up things, put them in your mouth, run around, poop and pee wherever. Then comes a time where forces in your life, first, often mom and dad, then the school and the outside world, generalized forms of mom and dad, say no. Prohibitions are put on actions so that one can become a civilized member of society. As development of the organism continues to unfold, the no's from the outside get more complex. They turn into moral and ethical mandates as opposed to ones of simple survival or cleanliness. No, young infant, you may not put that Lego piece in your mouth. No, you cannot poop on the counter. X, Jimmy, you should share with your brother. You're being selfish or you're embarrassing me right now. Stop that. Things parents regularly, when overstimulated, say to their children. Over time the sentence, internalized by the young child, loses its original enunciator and context while the effective value sticks. Through psychoanalysis, the patient is helped to reclaim the enunciation. Patients walk around with self-attacking statements in their heads, after trying too hard to fit in or failing at a social situation. A patient tells himself internally, "Oh, you idiot. Why did you do that? You're so stupid. Might as well hang yourself." This is a sentence which has lost its original enunciator. The original statement, spelled out, is "I, your father, think you, my daughter, are stupid for not being able to perform to my adult standards." This is of course an abstracted and reconstructed statement of something more like "Why did you do that? Come on, you should know better," which, as language theory tells us, contains an implied I think what you did is hard to make sense of, I think you should know better, and effectively, as language is a vehicle for effect, in general, and especially with children in a family situation, more than it is a medium for cognitive or intellectual information, communicates a message that is felt to the child as an attack or critique: "You're stupid." Thus, often I will ask, is that Johnny's belief or someone else's? Tune in for the next installment which, by Twitter's suggestion, will cover us straightforward comparisons, ideally with diagrams, between each theory's topological conception of mind, starting with Freud's 1898 interpretation of dreams model and moving forward from there. I lied, I need more time to appropriately cover the models of mind as they vary across psychoanalysts. Entry 3, but something else that is on my mind, representation. This will be a short edition, more tomorrow. D and G rip psychoanalysis a new one. Isn't psychoanalysis silly or bad because it reduces multiplicities and variations to single representations? Isn't representation old news? Yes and no. Gone is the old positivist psychoanalysis that looked for real material links between an object and its possible symbolic meaning. Here to stay, following the hermeneutic turn, is the kind of Kantian, synthetic, concerned with internal models of experience and knowledge, psychoanalysis Bion and Felix Guattari practiced. What this means is that the psychoanalytic experience is about creating links or connections, not necessarily tracing things back to the past, though it can be this, based on the patient's material. Meaning is made with the analyst, not uncovered. In a good analytic situation, overcoding, the analyst taking the analysand's material and rearranging it, squashing the patient's voice, subjectivity, rarely happens, but in the cases where it does happen, it is used only to help the patient further de- or uncode reterritorialization in the name of deterritorialization. Analysts have long since given up the technique of telling the patient how things are and instead get much more interested in their psychic reality, to use an old Freudian, Jungian term. Some time is spent learning about the person's experiences and the way they make sense of the world. When the patient becomes interested in the analyst to an extent that they seek input, the analyst asks questions to understand the function of the patient asking. When a consensus is met, often without it being an explicit statement between both parties, the patient and therapist can begin co-creating meaning. This might all seem like jargon, but I'll keep picking away until it makes sense. Entry 3.1. A few more quick notes on representation. A lot of crit theory critiques of psychoanalysis are concerned with its model of representation. Representation is bad. Symbolic value is bad. Significaiton is bad. The real is good. Blah blah blah. To an extent, there is a profundity to the critique here. Overly simplifying a patient's communications, or reducing their experiences to static and tired symbols and linguistic meanings can, to use Guattari's word, impotentize the patient and, ultimately, collude with the part of the patient that wants to avoid having feelings or exploring intolerable ideas. Furthermore, to rely on the Freudian lexicon and insist on strange and absurd interpretations that do not fit the context of the patient and their inner and outer world is to simply misunderstand the analysis part of the field while lapsing into dogma. However, very simply put, To critique psychoanalysis for its representational or symbolic tendencies is a flaccid critique that doesn't really interact with psychoanalysis. It's the equivalent of going to a horror movie and critiquing it for not having enough romantic drama, or being too scary. You don't go to a horror film for romantic drama. In abstract terms, it's like saying that red isn't loud enough, square isn't bright enough, etc. In more technical terms, to critique psychoanalysis for representation and symbolism, tied to language, is to commit what Kant would call a categorical error. Similarly, this is why Bion, a hardline Kantian, says that it is incorrect to critique psychoanalysis for not being scientific enough. He says, paraphrasing of course, psychoanalysis can't be not scientific enough, it can only be or not be psychoanalytic enough. So, when critics critique psychoanalysis for being these things, they are just saying it should be something else other than what it is. What the critics really mean is that psychoanalysis thinks representation and symbolism are important for helping people and understanding the human mind, which crit theory disagrees with and says, but, in reality, there is a lot to the world other than the representational. A psychoanalyst would agree with this. Yes, there are other ways of viewing the mind, but when one is doing psychoanalysis, one operates under the premise that things can be represented and that it can be of help to the person. This is why Guattari conceptualized a schizoanalysis, which was a practice of psychoanalysis, but with its critiques incorporated into it, a meta-analysis of psychoanalysis. Entry 4, Psychoanalysis in Plain Language, Some Notes on Neurosis, Character, Personality, Defense, etc. This is an early version of a section of a larger work on Nick Land, Mark Fisher, Suicide and Homicide. In addition to the theory, psychoanalysis is something best experienced as both an analyst and an analysand. True to the theories of psychoanalysis itself, the idiosyncratic concepts often don't click until they are effectively obtained, that is, felt in the body and enacted with another who has the fortitude to contain and interpret the enactment meaningfully, or, similarly, felt in the body, processed as emotion, and expressed as language. With that said, I will try to condense my own personal experiences as a patient and therapist, as well as years of literature research, into a few pages with the intention of demonstrating accelerationism's overlooked consistency with the therapeutic aspects of psychoanalysis. Broad strokes will be used to cover large tracts of ground quickly, which often has the effect of reifying large molar aggregates, though this is not the intention, and words will not be minced in any attempt to protect the reader's feelings, keep the reader's interest, or teach newcomers. This is a pain gauntlet, not a textbook. I am not a Schopenhauerian pessimist, believer in the resentful Freudian death drive, or any of that other high school existentialist nihilist type nonsense. However, it is a fact that being alive, despite its abundant pleasures and joys, and even with the abandonment of harmful overreaching moralism, is at its core an intolerable frustration that the somatic material, not to mention the mental circuitry being as it is an incorporeal feedback abstraction of this somatic material, struggles gravely to process. In fact, it is, by its overwhelmingly stimulating nature, never fully processed, and thus there exists an excess of intensities which are at all times overflowing and collecting into reservoirs of surplus which require, not necessarily discharge, as mechanistic models are outdated, but investment and expenditure. Take, for simplicity's sake, the average human organism. Its birth into the world constitutes an exit from a state of more or less immediate and unconscious comfort and gratification via the womb. Or, in other words, a state of low frustration. Once outside the womb, the infant is required to act, though still minimally, in accordance with an outside. There is a mouth to use, a nipple to latch onto, a body to position in space as to minimize discomfort, all frustrations. What card-carrying Nietzschean from Freud's early inner circle Otto Rank referred to as birth trauma. Still, however, the infant is, hopefully to an extent, the center of attention. The adults in its world not only organize the object world as to be conducive to the infant's development, baby-proofing the house, appropriate lighting, sound, temperature, etc., but they also respond to its needs by taking on the bulk of the responsibility, i.e. basic caretaking. As time progresses, this infant is required to take on more actions and responsibilities, and slowly becomes less and less the center of attention. Eventually the child must come to terms, on some register at least, that the parents aren't his or her sole possession, nor his or her sole provider of attention, and that they may not always give all their attention to the child. As the child becomes even older, he or she realizes that not only do the parents pay attention to each other at the expense of the child at times, but that others in the world exist, and that the objects and subjects of the world aren't determined or controlled by the child's will, wishes, or center of agency. That is, growing up is a slow process of building frustration whereupon the outside topples residual feelings of omnipotence which originally helped the infant survive. As developmental psychologists rightly show, children do gain mastery and agency, but whether or not this sense of control ever fills the wound torn open by birth is up for debate. Now, how exactly the individual navigates this wound essentially leads to character, or defensive psychic structure, i.e. mental illness. Too much time has been spent trying to find the origins of mental illnesses as if there is some hidden secret to be unlocked. Mental illness is, at its core, a resolution to a conflict that becomes reified, ossified, and inappropriately used as a static tool to approach dynamic situations that do not call for that static tool. In other words, somewhere along our development a challenge presented itself that required some kind of solution to continue living, and the solution was clung to as time went on. For example, a child feels, and the feeling may have to do with internal sensations, i.e. drives, or external objects, or both, that his household is dangerous, that if he is seen or noticed he will be the object of ridicule, criticism, attack, or worse, and thus, mostly in an unconscious manner, the child acts in a way that reduces the likelihood of receiving attention. He now flies under the radar, increasing his chances of survival. This child grows up to sit at the edges of the room, shy, introverted. This personality is appropriate, even advantageous, at times, but ultimately, if it is the only way one can approach any situation, say, a situation that calls for a more extroverted approach, then it is a detriment, and to rely on it is neurotic and creates life conflicts. In this sense, the neurotic goes through life attempting to stick a square peg in a round hole. The obsessional unconsciously believes that if he thinks hard enough about the minute details of the peg, the hole, or both, that somehow the peg will fit, or that the intolerable feelings of the fact that the peg will never fit will somehow be less intolerable. The depressive unconsciously believes that the peg, broken from repeated attempts at fitting it into the wrong hole for so long and thus discarded in the gutter, or simply broken through being is imperfect in relation to the idealism capable in the mind, will return, pristine, if only he were good enough. The hysteric and psychotic. We'll have to cover these at a later time. In a more general sense, the neurotic, whatever their particular condition and relation to the outside may be, cannot tolerate actual alterity, which by its very nature is outside the residual infantile fantasy of omnipotence, whether that be on the geological scale, i.e. the outside world of objects and the physical play of forces between those objects, and the people that populate that world who have wishes, desires, ideas, and feelings that are not always consistent with the subjects. The suicidal at his or her core is not depressed, he or she is angry. Life is not what it is supposed to be, but violence or anger feels intolerable, so the self is chosen as object of attack. But again, we will have to cover this more at length later. Entry 5, Suggested Readings. In no particular order. The work of the negative, Andre Green. New Fundamentals for Psychoanalysis, Jean Laplanche. The Shadow of the Object, Christopher Bollers. Learning from experience, Wilfred Bion. Attacks on linking, Wilfred Bion. Psychic, or mental, treatment, Freud. Negation, Freud. Mourning and melancholia, Freud. Purloined Letter Seminar, Lacan. Donald Winnicott and Melanie Klein, in general. Entry 6, Emotional reason for this blog. This entry will be a bit different. It is an entry about my own motivation for writing this blog bit. At the beginning I outlined some intellectual motivations, but this is an emotional motivation. Convoluted sentence inbound. I realize I feel like I imagine people of color or people of a certain gender feel when someone who is not of that in-group has strong opinions one way or another about something of important value to that in-group. For example, when people of color say white people shouldn't get to decide what is or isn't racist. When women say that men shouldn't pass laws about reproductive rights, etc. I don't seek the same legitimacy or authority, nor claim the same struggle as these groups. I don't want to identify as to avoid equating the object of my feeling, psychoanalysis, with the object of their feeling, race or gender, for a number of reasons, but I do think the feelings may be the same or similar. What gives all these philosophers any right to pretend to get psychoanalysis enough to criticize it? If you haven't been analyzed or trained analytically, one really has little grasp on the actual clinical literature, which tends to stay pretty confined to clinically trained psychoanalytic circles, and how the theory, which often does leak into other circles, is actually applied to clinical matters with real people. On the one hand, a lot of thinkers just use psychoanalysis for a stand-in for something that is wrong and outdated. You can't just psychoanalyze this or that, or psychoanalysis would say this, but we say that. More specific examples to come in later posts. That is, psychoanalysis is degraded. On the other hand, a lot of people want to call themselves psychoanalysts but seem to have never reflected on their own feelings in relation to another's, their own process of thinking, their own biases, and in many cases, have never sat with a patient. That is, psychoanalysis is glorified as a purely intellectual tool for doing this or that. To use another comparison, albeit an absolutely cringe one, my profession is not your costume. Entry 7, Self-analysis. Follower request. Psychoanalysis begins with the failure of medical treatment on European woman with what was then called hysteria, but it does not begin to really take off until Freud's 1900 masterpiece, actually 1899, but Freud changed the date for superstitional reasons, interpretation of dreams. One of the interesting things about IOD is that it does not so much focus on others' dreams, but on Freud's own dreams. That is, it is a book of self-analysis. In fact, many of Freud's discoveries over his lifetime come from self-analysis, including, as Lacan and D and G have pointed out, the Oedipal complex. In other words, self-analysis is there from the start in psychoanalysis and is crucial to the analytic endeavor, a trend that is clearly seen later in the history of psychoanalysis, 1950s-1980s. As it developed into the ongoing discussion regarding transference and countertransference. Countertransference is an important concept to touch on briefly, as it is essentially a form of self-analysis in relation to another person. How do I feel or think when in the presence of another who, to some degree, aims to impart or produce in me certain thoughts and feelings? When I sit with a patient, I monitor my inner experience. What Theodore referred to as listening with the third ear, or whatever, as I listen to the patient talk. What thoughts, ideas, and feelings are aroused in me? What do I make of these? Do they seem to readily connect to the patient's personality, or the content or form of their speech, or lack of? Maybe these thoughts, ideas, and feelings tell me something about the patient. Maybe they are completely disconnected and more about myself than the patient. This is important to highlight, as it seems to me that many of the pop psychoanalysts, whether on social media, the lecture circuit, the publishing circuit, etc., seem to get stuck analyzing other people and other things at the expense of meaningfully examining themselves, looking through a psychoanalytic lens at film, culture, literature, their enemies, other theories, etc. Rather than analyzing an incel on Twitter, pointing out this or that banality that only vaguely, if at all, maps onto anything substantial or clinical, look at yourself, in a non-hand-wringing and non-slave morality way of course, and see what you find. So how does one self-analyze? It's not something you can, or should, prescribe, but it is something you can outline if someone is interested in having a place to start. When you react to something, don't assume your reaction is the truth. X1, someone on my Twitter feed posts in a way that I interpret as being pompous, bombastic, arrogant, etc. The tone or subtext seems to me to read this is unquestionable truth and you're not worth my time, are stupid if you disagree. My initial reaction is to want to argue with this person. This is not the case. These are the reasons you have got this or that wrong. Rather than act, I instead get curious why I have had this reaction. What about this person taking these positions gets me to react in an argumentative way? Put aside the fact that the content could be right or wrong, as often factual disputes are erected and used as a way of covering up emotional disputes, and get curious about this dynamic. My conclusion: this person wants to communicate that they should be taken seriously, and should be taken as an authority on this matter. Even though I disagree with their take, I can understand and respect their wish to be seen as someone whose take is important. This may or may not be true, but it's a self-analysis that allows me to then post something encouraging or at least non-confrontational, or not post at all, in place of meaningless Twitter arguing. X2, Justin Murphy's Delu's book is all over Twitter right now. A good self-analysis moment for those so vocally decrying the book would be: what about this book bothers me so much? Hard mode, things like his take is stupid or there is no evidence for this don't suffice as answers. If these are the answer you arrive at, the next question to ask yourself is: so what about having a stupid take bothers me so much? Or so why does a take with what I consider a lack of evidence bother me so much? As Nietzsche points out, our thoughts and feelings are bound up with subjective values, and it is very often not the case that we truly have an earth-shatteringly clear and objective reaction to an event. As demonstrated above, try to find the motivation for your thoughts or feelings, and each time you arrive at a new idea, look for the idea before that. In regard to more internal matters, trust your gut feelings and following your own line of flight or chain of association. X1, I had a dream where I was killing people with a mounted machine gun. After killing a few people, I began running away through swampy woods to escape the people who had begun surrounding my mounted gun. In the dream the people were carrying AK-47s and shooting at me while yelling punitive and moralistic slogans at me as I ran away. There were in particular a few more slender and fast-running people who caught up to me more easily, threatening my safety with knives. Go ahead. Interpret this dream. You will never come up with a meaning other than the generic one that most people would come up with regarding violence, fear, etc. Upon waking up I self-analyzed the dream, which seemed to have absolutely no relation to my previous day or feeling states, and was immediately able to make sense of the dream. I first remembered visiting my longtime girlfriend's parents' house and watching a clip on my phone of a video game I sometimes play. The clip was of a Russian soldier using a mounted machine gun to kill the enemy team. This explains both the mounted machine gun killing and the AK-47s I dreamed up for the soldiers, AK being essentially a universal cinematic and real symbol for Russian involvement. So what of the swamp? The punitive and slender fast figures. The house I visited was in a significantly warmer, more humid climate than what I am used to, and the previous day, and most likely during the night, I had been profusely sweating. This most likely inspired the idea of a swamp, or swamp-like experiences. Next I associated to the fact that I was in someone else's house, and had to follow a set of rules I was not used to, which seems to connect to the slender and punitive figures. I am trailing off for the moment. Entry 8, Why, or How, IDK, Psychoanalysis fell, hard, to its death, out of fashion, or became fashionable at the expense of substance, IDK, not to mention some other stuff, follower requested. Consistent with entropic forces, the longer this blog exists, the quicker and dirtier it gets. In the early 1900s, psychoanalysis was, as Freud and Jung discussed it, a plague set to infect the globe. 100 years later it's been reduced to one of those viruses that, in being both mostly eradicated by the over-application of bleach and disinfectant wipes, American scientism, and also survived by generations that now have developed immunity to it, French mumbo-jumbo, has morphed into a dual-strand ultra-resistant hypervirus. Strand 1. The butt end of a joke. Strand 2. Hollow intellectual practice for social theorists to use to leverage their crackpot but oddly familiar theories with some kind of idiosyncratic quirky authority. That is, the latter, hyper-intellectual French abstraction, and the former, American pragmatist anti-intellectualism, came together in a pincer maneuver in the 50s to cut off psychoanalysis' head, leaving the bloated corpse to academics disconnected from clinical affairs who had never stepped foot in an analytic office, to analyze or be analyzed. Psychoanalysis, mired in its own internal political and theoretical struggles, responded poorly. The refugees of the psychoanalytic infighting took solace in Europe in the bulwarks of the Fruto-Marxist left, where they engaged in endless socio-philosophical debates about this or that reified concept, while others drifted towards the conservative reactionary right, some European fringe Lacanians and hardline Freudians, while in the US the psychoanalytic diasporians made flaccid legitimacy, authority appeals to science and sociology. This combination of clusterfucks gave the outside world every reason they needed to turn their back on psychoanalysis. It's either overly theoretical jargon that does not connect to my lived experience, or it's a kind of rehash of old social reformist conservatism, or a mixture of the two. Why do I need this fucking thing again? Couple this with the vector of anti-authority, which I have no verifiable or convincing genealogy for other than some speculation that the increased access to technology, the increased advancement of this technology, and the miniaturization and openness of and to information that was previously behind what were essentially paywalls, which, when coupled with the understandable fear of authoritarianism coming out of World War II, has led to a cultural impetus that tends towards individuals seeking their own justifications and knowledge, sometimes to their own benefit, sometimes not. Think flat earth, anti-vaxxers, self-diagnosers who use WebMD, etc. And we should remember traditional psychoanalytic technique required to some extent on important notions of authority, and we get a disinterest or hatred of psychoanalysis. To capture what I mean, a follower sent me an excerpt from a Bruce Fink book about a Lacanian analyst who, in typical Lacanian fashion, would end the patient's session a few minutes in every time as to communicate to the patient that the analyst had no time or patience to mess around with the patient's tendency to obsessively go on at length with defensive intellectualism. I replied that this might have worked when people valued the analyst's authority, a time where one actually said, "Wow, it's a true honor that this famous Lacanian has taken the time to see me," but now a patient will simply leave treatment and find a mystical guru or self-help coach that will feed them feel-good bullshit, or, even more likely, they'll go home and live a miserable life projecting their problems into and onto objects that in turn aid the narrative that all hope is lost, I am destined to be depressed, blah blah blah, etc. This is all without mentioning that the content of psychoanalysis, or what it aims at bringing awareness to, is precisely the stuff that people have worked to repress or keep out of consciousness. This content of psychoanalysis, i.e. the stuff we don't want to deal with, brings me to a separate point. A follower asked me my thoughts on the book The Courage to Be Disliked. I haven't read the book, but in browsing Twitter threads commenting on the book, it got me thinking about reiterating the plain, non-jargon content, tempted to say lesson. But this is too rationalistic, cognitive, punitive, of psychoanalysis. I'll have to say more on this in another entry, but for now I am very drawn to the idea that the patient eventually comes to experience the fact that others will think things about or have feelings about them that they do not agree with, and that the patient will too feel and think things about others that may be true but do not require the other to agree with in order for the truth to be effective. That is, it is my thinking that a patient should eventually get to a point where the validation of the other or an appeal to another's authority is no longer needed, but simply one factor among many to take into consideration when speaking and acting. Entry 9, Omnipotence and Desire. A tired, late-night, fun clinical thingy. So much energy is spent trying to account for how others will react to our own actions, feelings, thoughts, etc. We find ourselves trying to act in a way that both gets us what we want, and prevents us from receiving dystonic responses from others. The unconscious belief underpinning this, or the conscious thought that can be put to this unconscious behavior, is that we control others or can control others with our actions, feelings, thoughts, etc. Others will react how they are going to react, and one needs to keep this, as a reality, in mind when one acts or enunciates. This is the meeting of desires. Talking in psychoanalysis is about desire, enunciations of will to power, not order words. Many patients, children in particular, believe that the only reason to talk is to make others do something, change, or get them something. For these kinds of patients, talking is unconsciously believed to be a kind of mind control. Patient A: my mom always says X or Y and it makes me feel terrible. Therapist: well, that's terrible. What would happen if mom were told this things made people feel that way? Avoid using you and patient A's name as to allow patient ability to talk generally without feeling criticized for not being able to stand up for himself. Patient A: I want to tell her that, but it wouldn't do anything anyways. Therapist: she won't change? Patient A: nope. Therapist: then what do you have to lose? Could it feel better to simply get it out? That is, one shan't act or speak to control or change others, but enunciate so that it does not stay internally where it becomes an object of obsessional drift. Entry 10. The empty signifier of evidence-based. This is going in the psychoanalysis blog, but it's meaningfully connected to all my work on this blog, especially here. Lacanians, reacting to a brief period of time where comparing Lacan to Jung was cool, absolutely hate it when you compare Lacan to Jung. So, naturally we're gonna do it even if it doesn't really work. The signifier is a unique unit of being which, by its very nature, is the symbol of but an absence. It will be and will not be wherever it goes. Lacan 1966. When there was nobody to think, there was nobody to interpret what happened. Interpretations are only for those who don't understand. It is only the things we don't understand that have any meaning. Man woke up in a world he did not understand, and that is why he tries to interpret it. Jung 1934. The signifier signifies an absence. If something was immediately available as a presence, it would therefore not require a sign to stand in for it. In the name of an unlikely and hated synthesis, Lacan indicates we put a symbol in place of a reality that can't be experienced, and Jung says we necessarily are driven to explore these symbols for the very reason that we do not know the thing we are symbolizing. As long as there is something we don't understand, there is a desire to interpret or signify that lack of intuitive experience or understanding on some level, as we can only begin to interpret that which we don't immediately intuitively know or have as an internal object. Recently I realized this was no truer, and no more present, puns intended, than in the recent trend around evidence-based research in the social sciences field. Jonathan Sidler, 2015, has his own criticism of the term which is certainly worth reading, however I will not explicate it here. Rather, I will present two small vignettes as evidence, again pun intended, before moving on to my main exposition. Years ago I was invited to a meeting to discuss tutoring students for psychology at my undergraduate college, as I was a tutor of psychology in the same program during my stay at the school. Some professors of the psychology department and some other current tutors were concerned that, come second semester, students would no-show, or cancel tutor sessions. One tutor suggested we show up to classes and introduce ourselves, that way students are familiar with the tutors and aren't afraid to come to tutor sessions. Another suggested we hold a small seminar outside of class time. A teacher suggested we could try and relate with the students more. Another added that perhaps the students weren't aware how helpful tutoring could be. I contributed, has anyone asked the kids what is keeping them from coming the second semester? The tutors and professors considered the idea silently for a moment. I then added perhaps we could make a small survey in which they could choose a reason from a few provided on why they stopped coming in the second semester, and we could interpret the data. My suggestion received a courtesy nod and the previous conversations resumed. A friend I am close with invited me to sit in on a monthly staff meeting at his place of employment, a think tank, essentially. Whether they were trying to prove effects of certain substances on individuals as a theoretical foundation for a program, or whether they were trying to determine what should be included in said educational program for individuals, mainly parents and substance abusers. Neither conversation even considered what parents or substance abusers thought, felt, desired, or needed. That is, never in the conversation did anyone suggest actually gathering data from the source, the people the programs were intended to help. In both these cases what was considered helpful for these populations seemed to be unaffected by the actual reports of the people who constitute the population in need of help. There seemed to be preconceived ideas of what was or wasn't helpful that acted as axioms which colored and coded the discourse. The tying factor between these two vignettes is that the first group of people, psychology professors who have been teaching and working for years at an undergraduate level, and the second group of people, sociologists with political motives, both consider themselves to be evidence-based, and scoff at the mention of qualitative data. What the person in question, the object of the aim of all these social programs, has to think, say, or feel about their own experience is just whatever. In one case, the group represented in the second vignette went as far to discredit the methodology and findings of a study based on the fact that the data was solely consistent of people's self-reports about drug use. Their criticism was, of course, a drug addict will report positive experiences with the drug. Why would one even do a study like this? It doesn't document the harms. Here we see how distant from evidence-based social research has become. Rather than observe a phenomenon, it appears substance abusers enjoy using substances even if it is highly damaging to themselves on many levels, and then take steps to undergo more research in order to develop a framework to understand or interpret the data, or in the very least posit a hypothesis. The contemporary evidence-based crowd develops a particular discourse that evidence is grafted through as to filter out the aforementioned complexity and create a reformed object that seems more tolerable and easily formatted into common sense. The real hypothesis in this case could be something along the lines of, perhaps even though it would seem to make sense that a person would not engage in an activity knowing how unhealthy it is, there may be a more profound or complex series of motives or causes underneath this action. This warrants further study. Instead, this is deemed incompatible and in its place a simple one-to-one ratio devoid of unconscious motives is supplemented. This ends up looking like the person must not really be aware of how damaging the habit is, or we need to study the objective and physical effects of the drug rather than the subjective components that led to the subject using it. In a sentence, Marx thought the proletariat were duped into being part of capitalism, but, as Deleuze and Guattari utilizing Wilhelm Reich point out, we have a hand in our own groveling at the feet of the despot. This brings me back to Lacan. Here, in both these groups, evidence-based is an empty signifier. It sits in the space of absence where an actual foundation of evidence would otherwise be present. What evidence-based really means for these people is manifest, defended, experience constructed of traditional, cognitive, westernized common sense further constructed in and of colloquialisms, platitudes, and niceties. It is a type of ideology. Here, evidence-based is not a sign that indicates that the praxis, or theory is based, or founded on evidence, but rather, it serves as a frame. It says view what follows in this particular fashion regardless of the actual qualities of what follows. Take the first vignette. The conversation is ripe with preconceptions. The implied reasons conjured up by teachers and tutors on why students attended tutoring sessions significantly less in the second semester were because the tutors must be unfamiliar, the students must be afraid of coming, or they must not be able to relate to us. Generally the idea was that anxiety or the unknown was at the root cause. The subtext is, in a sentence, if people aren't doing something that seems to have obvious merit, it must be due to an obvious, and easily understood reason like fear. If we could just convince them of our relatability, and friendlessness, or perhaps appeal to fact that we are here to help, then they would simply cease to have these feelings and then would better align their inner perceptions to match with the external reality. The presupposition is what Freud would call reality principle. Motives are assumed, and assigned to people by other people on the notion of what is commonly accepted as a truth without a particular investigation into their idiosyncratic understanding or perception of the world. In regard to the signifier, evidence-based, here we can see there is really no evidence, but rather relatively baseless conjecture. This particular ideology permeates our entire culture. The media assumes that the racist, sexist, or homophobic person is not educated, and that if he or she were educated, he or she would surely be on the other side of the fence. The solution for these people, and they are looking for solutions, means to ends, not processes of understanding, is a book, a program, or a platitude. The thought doesn't occur that many well-educated people are racist, sexists, and homophobic, for these are related to psychological and social developments and emotional conflicts, not necessarily cognitive education. Entry 11, a brief dive into Kleinian object relations theory. Putting aside the fact that simplifying any theory is unacceptable on the grounds that it defeats the very purpose of theory, that of explaining phenomenon in terms that are more detailed and intricate than the phenomenon would otherwise present itself during practical or layman discourse, i.e. simplified theory is a tautology as the phenomena theory is trying to get at is already in its simplified form, we are going to be very bad simplify object relations. Patients come to analysis with the idea that it is the world outside that makes them bad, everyone else has the problem. If everyone else just changed I would be fine. This is humanism. Humanism asserts that the human is generally good and that outside forces corrupt the individual, both a philosophical position and a psychological and therapeutic school via Carl Rogers. This position the patient begins at is linear and unidirectional. Their world outside exerts influence on me internally and I am a passive receiver of that influence and therefore a product of that world. Or, in the case of those who self-attack, the message is I am bad and unworthy of this world which is good. I put badness into this world. In both cases, there is a clear unidirectionality. In the former, the subject is passive and the world is active. In the latter, the subject is active and the world is passive. Object relations precisely rejects this unidirectional victim-perpetrator dynamic. In place of this, object relations posits a bidirectional and complex interrelationship, one might say dialectical, but I want to avoid the pitfalls of Hegelianism so I won't use this word, where both subject and object are passive and active at the same time, each moving in both directions, mutually influencing each other as they move, to a degree. What is meant by Freud's after-effect, deferred action concept. Whereas the neurotic says it is the world that is bad and me that is good, and this world makes me bad, The matured via analysis object relations patient says I act in a way that gets me into situations where I create a bad world, or I act in a way as to reconfirm my own perception of a bad world, and this isn't say the world doesn't have its badness as the saying goes, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. The mature object relations patient recognizes his or her part in the enactment. In the case of if everyone else would just change, the object relations patient realizes that her term everyone necessarily includes his or herself. This is because for object relations, the criteria for what defines an object is, to an extent, relative. Person B is an object in the experience of person A, the subject. At the same time, person A is an object in the experience of person B, the subject. See the previous comment regarding mutually influential vectors. This is also Sartre as hell as other people. The subject makes the other an object. This dynamic is not true for those who first come to treatment. For those who first come to treatment, the subject-object relation is, as I mentioned earlier, rigid and fixed. The subject is impressed upon by a world of objects, or the subject impresses upon a world of objects. Object relations is much more complex than this neurotic position. A affects B, and at the same time, B affects A, and each time A and B affect each other there is created a third, A, B, and the point A and B meet, a point which is different depending on whether A is meeting B or B is meeting A. We can call where A meets B an X and we can call where B meets A a Y. This gives us a lot of permutations to work with. ABX, BAX, XAB, AXB, BXA, ABI, BAY, YAB, AB, BIA. Etc. This brings us back to simplified object relations. There is a philosophical underpinning here that should be addressed. Object relations not only aims to implicate the subject in his/her role in whatever the worldview of the subject is, it also has written into its metaphysics, if we can call it that, the idea that there is no pure object or thing in itself. Or, if there is a thing in itself, object relations theorists don't really care about it, or it's inseparable from the object as perceived via being an unsymbolizable residue, i.e. Lacan's real. An object is always already a mediated thing. It is a representation spurred into being by fragmented sensory data which is reconstructed and translated into symbolic terms, or otherwise left at a somatic level, and therefore transforms into some sort of fantasy, a fantasy which is then projected onto the skeletal structure that spurred the original fragmented sensory data into being, thus causing a doubling up or feeding back of some aspects of the skeletal structure complemented by an eroding of other aspects. A musical metaphor comes to mind. There is an experimental musical performance where someone records a simple sound in a large room with good reverberation. The sound and its reverb is then played back and re-recorded into another device. This continues to repeat. The effect is that the reverb from the room continues to amplify itself. The frequencies best captured by the reverb continue to become more pronounced while the frequencies originally muted become more muted until they disappear. This is the process of projection and introjection. This is surely not the way patients come into our practices. The naive patient relies on an old Enlightenment tradition of naturalism. My insides reflect my outsides in a unidirectional manner. Object relations, and it is no coincidence here that Bion and Britton are Kantians, relies on a semi-Kantian constructivist hybrid idea that an object is already always mediated to an extent, and that a mirror naturalism model is false and actually a neurotic, or psychotic, form of defense. Entry 12. Some elaborations on earlier polemics, etiology and authority. In previous entries I touched upon two unrelated topics, non-psychoanalysts making claims or critiques about psychoanalysis, and the notion that we spend too much time trying to figure out what causes mental illnesses. Here's a combination of the two that I stumbled upon today. Pete Wolfendale, who, despite probably being smart and nice, I find to be a particularly intolerably mixture of annoying and boring, posted this tweet about this article. I didn't really read the article, and neither should you, because it's inconsequential. What got me was Wolfendale's tweet. He writes, "One more piece of evidence that bipolar disorder is neurodegenerative." Wolfendale is a philosopher who, according to his self-identifiers, is bound up with figures such as Kant, Heidegger, and Deleuze, and is associated with OO, object-oriented ontology, philosophy. He's not a psychoanalyst or even a psychoanalytic theorist, though he has read Deleuze and did study at Warwick, where Nick Land and Mark Fisher studied, and OO has some crossover with Zizek, so he is certainly aware of psychoanalysis. But who isn't in academia? Though he's not making any claims about psychoanalysis, he is making a claim about the etiology of a disease or condition that would be better left to people who actually work in real, everyday situations with these people. And this is not to say that people can't theorize, or do or say whatever they want. I encourage everyone to do what they want as long as they're mindful of how it might affect their likelihood of getting what they want out of their life. But this is all still besides the point. The slept approach to this would be to argue that neurological models of understanding mental health make this or that mistake, which I think they do, or that a layman or non-analyst should not make claims to what is or is not the cause or nature of mental illnesses, conditions, whatever, etc. We're not doing either of these. As we said, these are slept. We woke. Woke, etiology, when it comes to good psychotherapy, doesn't really matter. Etiology is to be constructed by the analyst, and the analyses aren't based on the former's understanding of the latter's self-reports. Okay. A bold statement. Let's unpack it. I think when arguing, debating, discussing others, whether the stakes are high or low, one should always be generous to the other argument. Assume it is right, but does not quite have the effect the arguer intends it to. You need to create a common ground with your other and then come to a point of clear agreement or disagreement. No point in fighting tooth and nail over stuff that is, at the end of the day, not really connected to the comings and goings of the outside world. So, let's just assume that X mental illness is totally neurological, physical, genetic, whatever. So what? As a talk therapist, this won't change how I approach my interventions. In other words, the point of identifying a clear and indubitable etiology for an illness is so that the scientific method and its abstractions can be applied accurately with limited actual experience of the thing at hand, relying on data points, quantitative stuff, etc. Science wants to say disease X is caused by A and B because A and B are the causes. Treatment Y and Z should be utilized as they have been deemed effective in trials, research. The point of determining etiology is to determine how to approach the treatment. This works for medicine and physical surgical manipulation, not for talk. The genius of psychoanalysis is that the cybernetic and affective aspects of speech or communication are used to relieve symptoms through producing mental effects. Think the placebo effect, or CCRU concept of hyperstition, without making direct physical changes. I leave with a discussion between myself and a supervisor that sums up what we have been saying. I was being criticized by a colleague for relying on the idea that depression was caused not only by an investment in a lost internal object, but also the superego's repression of intolerable feelings of anger, anger that then gets turned inwards out of fear or retaliation or violence, etc., as opposed to treating depression as some sort of chemical imbalance, or social ill. Supervisor, what difference does it make, right? The intervention is all the same, help the patient talk and see what you can do in the transference to help. Entry 13, Kantianism in Psychoanalysis, 13.1 to elaborate on Kant. There's a lot written on Freud's secret Kantianism, not to mention the similarities between some of Lacan's conceptualization of desire and Kant. However, there are actual Kantian psychoanalysts such as Bion and Britton. Here's a little bit of old case data that will end up in a book I am writing on Guattari. The patient, An older man with schizophrenia becomes angry in session at times, but, as is par the course for schizophrenia, finds his anger intolerable. To understand, let us consider Mr. R.'s talk of frozenness through the thought of two German idealist philosophers. 1. It is a Hegelian double negation, as Lacan or Zizek might argue. 2. It is a Kantian category of knowledge, what Bion, a Kantian, would call plus K, or what Britain, also a Kantian, would call a counterbelief. That is, rather than defend his feelings of being hot and angry by negating it, I am not feeling hot and angry, vague, indefinite, but could mean frozen, he instead substitutes or counters with the positively framed phrase I am feeling frozenized in place of the negation phrase. This is less confusing and more clinically relevant than it may seem. One may communicate the same thing in many ways. A. I am hot. This is the affirmative or positive. B. I am not hot. This is the negative to statement A. C. I am cold. This is the affirmative or positive that expresses one of many possible meanings as the negative phrase. B. I am cold is a positively framed negation of the phrase I am hot. I am feeling frozenized, I am not feeling hot. The two phrases share the same referent but demonstrate different semantic approaches to the same communication. Though, of course, semantic approach may itself be an important communication, but space does not allow us to engage this idea here. Entry 13.1, Kant in Psychoanalysis. A wide therapeutic resistance, in patients and therapists alike, which is often not addressed properly, is the fear of knowing and creating, which is disguised as the wish for learning. The analyst who brought this to our attention in the analytic community is Wilfred Bion. As a therapist, my oeuvre stresses the Bionian concept of knowledge as an effectual experience of the here and now, which requires no hard and fast rigid, logical or rational aspects. For Bion, a feeling is a fact. I've used this intervention on a heavily guarded patient to much success. When one reads anything, or sits with any patient, one does not ever not know. Not knowing is predicated on an idealized notion, written as what is supposed to happen, of what it means to know. One already always knows one's internal experience. I sit here with this patient and am filled with the feeling of not being able to think in their presence. I know that this patient does not want me to know. I know I feel frustrated with this experience, etc. Or, when a student says I don't know what the author is trying to say here, what they are saying is I currently know my own feeling as a fact, frustration, and that effectual fact disturbs me, because I think I shouldn't feel this way, to the point where I disavow my knowing of it. In other words, we trick ourselves into thinking it's not that I am frustrated, it's that I don't know. One always knows the other through the self. This is, after all, the essence of the idea of countertransference. What does this have to do with countertransference? The I don't know resistance is a countertransference resistance, one we see in our patients. We ask them to expand on an idea. They reply I don't know. The entry-level therapist is shut down and accepts this. A well-trained therapist responds with you don't have to know anything here, just give me a guess or make it up or any hypothesis, or whatever comes to mind or, etc. etc. For example, when a patient of mine in a group says something and the other group members respond with I don't understand or I don't get it, it is not that they haven't understood their fellow, no matter how unclear he is being, but rather, it is that they've let a frustrating experience block their intuitive and instinctive ability to synthesize the available data into a likely narrative or meaning, or synthetic knowing. They have crossed out their ability to make meaningful links and associations to this fellow's words and effect which would allow an internal transforming and sense-making of his utterances. Compounding this is a snaky resistance, what I call the Socratic neurotic I avoid saying, acting I know because one can only learn when one admits one does not know. This has the effect of appearing like a defense. Resistance is actually a positive trait, eager to learn, when learning actually comes from curious application of here and now, in the moment knowledge, It is a fact I feel such and such a way, etc., etc. This is what Britain, also a Bayesian and Kantian, would call a counterbelief. To some, I will be a happy camper the day I hear my patients be able to say, in their own language of course, I observed feelings of frustration in myself while listening to that, reading that, and that frustration made me want to fall back on the idea that I didn't know something, but I realize I know my own feeling of frustration, and through being aware of this, I realize that I know more about what that person said, the text I read, than I initially thought, as when I mentalize my frustration I free my mind up to be curious and make connections that, when curious, readily come with little effort. The main takeaway is that the analyst needs to take in what the analysand is putting out and find a way to return it to the analysand in a tolerable way. Kant makes a reappearance with Ogden, who relies on Bayern, who in one paper, which I forget, has a section in one of his papers on the transference matrix entitled Sexual Things in Themselves. The thing in itself of course being Kant's concept of the non-experienced entity or set of forces which is known to exist via a priori reason, also known as noumena. Freud's primary process or Lacan's real is basically noumena. Raw experience that cannot be known or symbolized, only experienced as affective intensity. This kind of Kantian affirmative vitalism is exemplified well in Betty Joseph's concept of the total situation, which is also the title of her paper in which the concept appears. For Joseph, the psychoanalytic process is always active and in motion. Everything, even nothing, is something, as nothing does not indicate a not being, but rather indicates what old Jewish physicians, Freud is not far off from this general description, such as Moses Maimonides would term apophatic, or using negative phrases to denote a positive. Maimonides' concept of God also beautiful lines up with D and G's bow, which I will talk about in another time. This apophatic negative indicates several things. In this sense, psychoanalysis is always affirmative and positive, but not necessarily positivistic. This connects to the theme I've been developing here, K, knowledge, and we will see this come up again in Boller's the unthought known, or Bayern's K. We know it, it animates us from the unconscious, but we don't know we know it yet. Or, Bayern's mystical idea that thoughts wait around until a thinker is found to think them, which beautifully mirrors Whitehead's idea that the subject is produced as a residual of material forces in the world, the superagent, or D and G's idea that forces create the subject or the assemblage of enunciation. Even, as Joseph mentions, when the patient comes to us and remains silent, or talks about his boring day-to-day life, we are learning many things on many different levels. A nothing gives us knowledge through the form of the nothing. This is a good practical putting to use of Freud's old adage that there is no negative in the unconscious, no in the unconscious. How does this relate more to K? Joseph puts forth her idea that the analysis is always active and in motion because we can always learn something even from nothing. This is because there is no such thing as nothing, just somethings and somethings. And any nothing we come up with is really a refusal on the analyst's part to be where the patient is or needs to be. I'm reminded of a conflict I had with a supervisee. She was stating that she did not get the patient, which I mentioned is in fact a good grasp on where the patient is at. This is the K function, and the idea that there is always something going on in the transference. It is not that there is something that is not understood or unknown, a negative. It is that my supervisee understood or knew the patient and had an adverse reaction to it, didn't like what she saw, so to speak, so she attacked the link that would give her knowledge into the patient, just as the patient attacks her own link when they do not like what they see in themselves. In a Kantian sense, we are always making sense out of anything put in front of us, a la the transference is always affirmative and inducing us with knowledge. To be specific, we only learn from the negative. A good supplementary reading on Joseph would be Andre Green's entire book The Work of the Negative, if we are viewing the whole situation. The direct communications, indirect communications, enactments, slips of tongue, dreams, etc. need to be viewed only in relation to one another and ultimately in relation to the analyst. They don't mean much on their own. Another part of this whole situation business is the general feeling and position the patient puts us in. Am I always worried about being late for the sessions? When I am in session, do I constantly want to make interventions when they are not required? The whole situation is all of the aforementioned. Whereas most Clinians are secret Kantians, Boller's studied under or was analyzed by, it is unclear, and I haven't done enough research, a Heideggerian, that is, a disciple of philosopher Martin Heidegger. Though, living in London and training at Tavistock, he is thoroughly consistent with previous thinkers such as Joseph, Pick, who we have yet to mention, Bion, etc. etc. His concept of the evocative object is from Bion, Klein. Consistent with Joseph and Klein, Bollers talks of the total situation. Further consistent with Joseph, the analyst always has an influence on the analysand which creates in the analysand an instinct to aid. In some cases, the analyst yes, that was a good interpretation even though the interpretation was actually bad, or more subtly, I had this dream. A dream which is clearly couched in analytic jargon, dreamt for the analyst. The content can be mostly disregarded. The form or expression says, look, you are a good analyst, and thus I have brought you a gift. I want to end this rant on a moment that synthesizes some of the Kantian strands brought up and how they relate generally to psychoanalysis. As I have noted earlier in this blog, Bion decried any notion of criticizing psychoanalysis as unscientific simply because that criticism does not meaningfully apply to psychoanalysis. That is, calling psychoanalysis not scientific enough is like calling psychoanalysis not religious enough. Alternatively, and this is my metaphor, it's like criticizing baseball for not being basketball enough. Bion's idea here comes from Kant, and as we have shown, Bion was an unabashed Kantian. Kant had similar things to say, like how you would not say the color orange is not round enough. That is, roundness is not a necessary quality to define what is or is not orange. Likewise, we would not say the cube is green enough to be a cube. The criticism must match the categorically necessary features. We can only criticize science for not being scientific, and we can only criticize psychoanalysis for not being psychoanalytic enough. Entry 13.2 Kantian Model of Mind in Psychoanalysis, Ron Britton. The only thing that I felt encouraging in that respect was in reading a book on the introduction of German philosophy, 2 centuries ago into England, when Kant was the major philosophical figure. And it was simply an account of how long it was before it was acknowledged in England. It was more than 50 years before Kant was anything other than ridiculed in the British intellectual tradition, despite the fact that the people doing the ridiculing couldn't read Kant because he hadn't been translated, and they didn't read German. But that was even better reason for rejecting him, because he wrote in another language. Ron Britton in interview with the UK Institute of Psychoanalysis, 2010. Britton in his paper Psychic Reality and Unconscious Belief flawlessly applies Kant to clinical and theoretical psychoanalysis. For Britton, belief is to psychic reality as perception is to material reality, a distinction bound up with active, passive positions. We do not actively perceive this world, or actively will ourselves to perceive it. I do not command my eyes to see or ears to hear. I do not will my senses to synthesize and be imbued with a sense of cohesion, time, and space. This world impresses upon me some set of chaotic experiences that I automatically assemble into sense and nonsense. And if I wish not to experience these things, they can only be avoided through altering my senses, close my eyes, block my ears, etc., or negating positives. I didn't see that, that didn't happen, or repressing experiences. Away it goes, into the vault. Perception, and eventually belief, is a synthesis of all sorts of psychological and physical processes, and these processes construct and constitute and work with the material of the experiences impressed on us. We create reflections or representations of experiences, or part of Melanie Kleon's object relations theory. There is no one-to-one correlation between objects and perceptions, which would imply an active object and a passive receiver. We're getting into CCRU territory here: Kant, belief, effect. Britton writes, unless a fantasy has the status of belief, it does not have consequences. You might argue that the disbelief of a fantasy may have consequences. The unbelief of a fantasy may consequences. Non, and dis should be distinguished. Kant did this, and it is where we get unconscious instead of non-conscious. Leaves room for movement and escapes binary logic. The answer to this is that the only reason one would negate a belief into a disbelief, or disavow it, would be if one already believed in it to begin with. A fantasy we haven't given meaning or weight to, belief, has no reason to be negated or disavowed. He goes on: subjective belief precedes object evaluation, which is basically Kant's project across all his works, reconciling science and religion. We believe in some sort of coherence or meaning, or attribute value to certain events and causal explanations before we have knowledge. Every day we operate on belief or faith that things will be as they were yesterday without actual knowledge, other than internal consistency, of the fact. I have no intimate knowledge of how my internal organs are operating at this very moment, but I have faith that my heart will continue to pump blood. The concept Britton introduces after elaborating on these notions is counterbelief, pg. 20, which seems to be a fantasy about a fantasy. It is overlooked in most psychoanalytic encounters. Analysons unconsciously put forth clichés and banalities in psychoanalytic jargon to appear as good patients to avoid their real issues. In this sense, counter-belief is sort of like Lacan's purloined letter, or Deleuze and Guattari's repressing representation. A whole parallel set of fantasies are devised to throw the analyst off track. I've certainly caught myself doing this in my own analysis. In everyday language, this is when someone interviewing for a job, when asked what their greatest weakness is, replies with something they don't feel too bad about admitting: I work too hard, or sometimes I am disorganized. Never will they say I detest authority and act in small ways to sabotage the workflow in the workplace. Entry 13.3 Kantian Model of Mind in Psychoanalysis. Ogden in his introduction to reading Bion begins by quoting Bion at length. In the Introduction to Learning from Experience, Bion's book, Bion carefully and patiently explains to the reader how he would like this book to be read. The book is designed to be read straight through once without checking at parts that might be obscure at first. If the reader will read straight through, those points will become clearer as he proceeds. He goes on. First, the reader must be able to tolerate not knowing, getting lost, being confused and pressing ahead anyway. What it is to learn from experience, or the inability to do so, will be something for the reader to experience firsthand in the act of reading this book. In other words, if the reader is to engage in something more than merely reading he must become the author of his own book, his own set of thoughts. Psychoanalytic writing as an effort not to report, but to create an emotional experience. Putting aside the fact that this is precisely how Anti-Oedipus, and much of Guattari, was written and should be read, this is how one should approach interacting with any mind or text. It's how the mind works with the world, as elaborated in 13.2. I don't have much more to say on this, as I think it speaks for itself, and the reader should use their own mind to construct a belief or a meaning here instead of relying on me. Entry 14, Some Notes on Freud, a primer for Andre Green. We will briefly cover some main points from two of Freud's integral papers before ending with a general explication of a basic psychoanalytic concept. A note on the unconscious in psychoanalysis. Freud's conceptualization of presence and absence in psychoanalysis is necessary to the understanding of the unconscious but often left out of clinical discussion. Freud seems to indicate the presence of absence. We cannot imagine an absence. Go ahead, try and think of nothing or a lack or absence of something. You have to think of the thing first before you negate it, or experience a real absence. we can only symbolize an absence, and even that symbolization of an absence is itself some sort of presence. If we tune our observing ego well enough, we can catch when a conception, or any other psychical, mental, element becomes absent and then present again. I want to add that often we do not know something, X, is present or absent, especially if it is unconscious, but we may recognize when X deviates from its current position, X moves from present to absent or from absent to present. In movement we tend to recognize it. We do not experience presences and absences, but experience, only in hindsight, the feeling of the motion between presences and absences. A thought had a change. Motion is necessarily bound up with time. This idea of retrospective, temporal, change is important. In regard to the person who is hypnotized, the archaic precursor to psychoanalysis, to execute a command later on, but not the whole of it, hypnotized command, emerged into consciousness, only the conception of the act to be executed, p. 261. That is, we don't consciously integrate the feelings, thoughts, or language from processes that have become unconscious, but we tend to act them out without knowing. The dangerous thing is then the rational mind can apply some sort of context to the unconscious act and quickly subsume it to a defensive narrative. In other words, 1. Unconscious idea. 2. Relatively conscious action. 3. Retroactively assigned reason for conscious action to fill the void of causality our phenomenological experience necessitates. This is where some psychoanalysts get off with claiming character or ego is displaced or empty. What I say I am is never really what I am, or was, because I have already assigned a different meaning to it than there was in the moment, unless one is analyzed for many years perhaps. In this same paper where Freud introduces these conceptualizations of presence and absence is a wonderful comparison of the mind to photography on page, photo negative, photo positive, etc. It's like when Sartre, though for the most part completely misunderstanding psychoanalysis, says that man is the negation of all things. To an extent this is true, negation is necessary for thought. Imagine an endless association of positive phenomenon or positive words closely attached to representations. This is the horror of psychosis in many ways, and we will touch upon this later with Green's work of the negative. Inhibition of symptoms. With a little bit of presence and absence covered, we can quickly get into the metapsychology. This inhibition, symptom model is derived from the economic metapsychology. We see Freud's use of economics directly when he uses the analogy of a banker and money to explain that the symptom and inhibition occur through an instinct, drive being dammed up, unsatisfied, repressed. This dammed up energy then becomes bound up through a counterintuitive reinvestment. That is, X, instinct, is unsatisfied RS or I, symptom, inhibition, formation RS or I formation is reinvested in with X, instinctual energy, our feedback cycle emerges, return of the repressed, repetition compulsion. Aside, does this not show the absurdity of the notion of a biological death drive, which we will get to later? If a symptom or inhibition is a damming of libido, libido becomes bound and expressed as symptom, and this very bound quantity becomes further invested with what energy is left in the economy, unbound quantity, resulting in the repetition compulsion, maintenance of symptom and conditions adequate for such maintenance. Then is it not safe to say that self-destructive or counterintuitive behaviors and thoughts are not a manifestation of some inherent pull towards death, but simply a blockage in a flow of libido? I think so. We should move towards reframing the death drive as a lack of available libido due to poor investment, not an active force itself. In Deleuze and Guattari's language, the death drive is an articulation of libido or the life drive. End aside. Now we have a subject with a symptom or inhibition. When we think of this process in light of the facts that 1. Satisfying our instinct drive may actually bring about unpleasure, loss of meaning, the little death, depression towards the end of a fantasy, etc., and 2. Great pleasure may be derived from putting off satisfaction. We can then see that the investment in a symptom or inhibition may be more naturally occurring and sustaining than the contrary. That is, it should be clear to us why our patients cling to their illness. Now that we have viewed the process by which the symptom, inhibition forms, Freud points out that a distinction is needed between symptom and inhibition. A symptom occurs from repression of instinct is a sign or substitute for an instinct is a strange side effect or new phenomenon for an instinct is necessarily pathological. An inhibition, often of a sexual and aggressive nature or related to these instincts, often a restriction or lowering of a function of the ego, isn't necessarily pathological. An example of a symptom is organ failure, hysteric reactions such as body seizing, going blind, etc. An example of an inhibition is inability to write, fingers cannot clinch pen, mind cannot produce ideas to be written. Other interesting comments on this paper: Freud warns us that we may be led astray if we overestimate the role of the superego in the process of repression. Repression is originally the ego rejecting the id. Freud warns us of taking his structural model, id/ego/superego, too rigidly. He reminds us that the ego is the organized part of the id, and the superego is a specialized part of the ego, articulations, not rigid separate entities. In this sense, there is really only id, libido, and its derivatives. This supports my above-aside libido and its vicissitudes. No wonky death drive. We do not have a protective shield for internal processes, but we do have one for outside, so it is likely that our internal protective measures are modeled on our external ones. Though Freud does not go this far, this helps us understand projection. The inside needs to be put outside so that it may be dealt with. Freud offers us a helpful definition for resistance, an action undertaken to protect repression, anti-cathexis. Out of the economic metapsychology, which is built on a notion of presence of absence, comes the death drive. Some notes on the death drive. The 19th century was arguably the century of mechanism, and 1920 was a big year for physics. These mechanistic physics, best exemplified by the physicalist school of Bruck and Helmholtz, whom Freud's early professors were cultish followers of, was still fresh from its academic battle with the vitalism/animism arguments derived from natural science, a field which itself emerged from German idealism, naturphilosophy, and early Greek philosophy. The lineage is something like pre-Socratics, greater than Aristotle, greater than Descartes, greater than Hume, greater than maybe Schelling here Kant, greater than all of this is immensely present, almost to the point of getting in the way, in Freud's 1920 game changer beyond the pleasure principle. In short, Freud, relying on physicist laws like the law of constancy or conservation, with a heavily implied use of the law of entropy, as well as using Fechner and other scientists of the time, argues for a drive separate to libido which he calls the death drive. The argument loses its sense of profundity when laid bare. There is inert, inanimate material. Somehow it forms a crust or surface upon which tension levels are required to be regulated. Following the law of constancy, the organism must want to reduce external tension to maintain a homeostatic internal state. Too much or too little tension disrupts this threshold and creates in the basic psychic apparatus an unpleasant tension. Thus, we have the pleasure principle. An organism wishes to maintain a certain base level of tension in relation to its environment. Despite these shaky vitalistic beginnings, it gets worse. Here's where Freud really mucks it up. What if an organism wanted to maintain this homeostatic function to the extent that it realized, following the metapsychological assumptions of a libidinal economy of cathecting and decathecting bound and unbound energy, that it would be more economically efficient to reduce tension to a minimum point than it would to tirelessly maintain tension at a base level requiring a modulation of levels both up and down, all to the extent that the psychic apparatus really aimed to extinguishing life, not maintain it. This is a philosophical speculation about natural physical systems wrapped up in the outdated and oversimplified physics of the 19th century, which thrown in alongside some child observation, which is one of my favorite moments in all of Freud, despite what it lacks in really evidencing the death drive, microbiology, which is misunderstood, and clinical, cultural empirical evidence, patients who repeat destructive acts and war. Oh, not to mention a little jab at Nietzsche, power instinct. This is without mentioning the fact that, and this is consistent with my above critiques of the 19th century discourse which reaches back into 17th century naturphilosophy, the whole second part of this paper, 20 pages and on, is basically an adaptation of Kant's work on categories of understanding dressed up with 19th century psychoanalytic language. I have written a 9,000-word paper that will eventually be a book expanding on these themes and reviewing the science, and I must say all my research indicates that Freud's science was outdated for even its time, and, in short, if we do not start with the law of conservation as governing physical systems as a basic assumption, then the rest of the death drive argument falls apart. With all this said, this reading is absolutely key to psychoanalysis and metapsychological economics. Freud was obviously a genius, and his attempt to tie together various epistemological and methodological models to form a philosophical view on the human organism is excellent. And with this said, the death drive is not naturalistic or scientific concept, as Deleuze and Guattari point out. It is a way out of a problem. If pleasure guides us, then why do we have war? Why do my patients maintain these bad habits? Why do I, Freud, smoke my joy into oblivion and alienate all my friends? Or, more broadly in relation to the vitality of psychoanalysis, the death drive solves the problem of naive humanism. The death drive is an ethical position, an as if, that says even if this is bogus science, who cares? It's not about the science. It's about acting as if you had a death drive in you, or whatever, because humanism relies too heavily on projecting the negative into the environment where it can be left undealt with. The death drive brings the conflict back to an internal level. This much is correct and on track, but Freud's 19th century method is not. Okay, time for André Green. Entry 15, follower request, Jenkinson on death. Just kidding. André Green will come later. I've slipped too much into the deep theoretical and clinical aspects of psychoanalysis. We need to get back to being quick and dirty. A follower of the blog sent a podcast my way, Stephen Jenkinson, Die Wise, How to Understand the Meaning of Death, kindly asking for my psychoanalytic take. Jenkinson is talking about death, a subject that psychoanalysis, for a number of reasons, has always had a lot to say about. Theoretically, what comes to mind immediately is that Freud famously said that death has no model in the unconscious, which simply means that considering the UCS is composed of either repressed experiences or repressed or sublimated drives, and some combination of these, we have no internal memory or imagination derived from actual occurrence regarding death. Speaking of consciousness as opposed to unconsciousness, by the nature of death, of course, if we have died we don't live to tell the tale. TL, doctor, if we haven't died we can't have a model of it. Because of this, having a vague idea of something that never happened, and because we at some point know it will happen, that is, we will die, which the existential psychoanalysts pick up nicely on, we live with an ambivalence or anxiety towards death. But this is all old news. Pragmatically, as psychotherapists we often deal with people who have an ambivalent, a word Jenkinson talks about for a bit, relationship to death. The suicidal patient comes because part of them doesn't want to kill themselves. Other patients come because they are afraid of their wishes to kill or destroy. Others are not aware of their suicidal or homicidal wishes or conflicts and come to us with symptoms that expresses these conflicts. Schizophrenics, as they progress through treatment, are able to talk about having childhood experiences where as children they feared killing their parents or destroying the whole world. in their imagination, not often in reality. Depressives often won't or can't get in touch with their violent or angry thoughts, and thoughts aren't actions, nor their wishes to kill. Wish is fantasy, not plan or reality. We all have thoughts about things without acting on them. To be brief and reductive, when these people can get in touch with these feelings and wishes, their depressive symptoms begin to lessen and they are able to have a wider range of feelings. Manics in part believe they are omnipotent. They feel they can't die. Chronic anorexics constantly disavow the terrible feelings related to the danger they put themselves in through malnutrition. And this is of course without mentioning that we as therapists might be working with people who are not depressed but melancholic due to a death of a loved one, or their own impending death due to a chronic illness. But back to Jenkinson. He's all a bit too Christian in his notion that life is in a way a slow death or process of dying, or that death grants life another shot, that death is what gives meaning, etc., or whatever. But he is also Nietzschean in his quest for affirmation, his intolerance for morose and depressive defenses against life, and Buddhist mystification of passive death, and, as the scholars say, was not Nietzschean a self-aware Christian trying to remedy his own nihilistic illness? He points out early, in an introduction teaser clip, something to the effect that in a world with constant heartbreak, we try to have less heart, and why shouldn't death be heartbreaking? To loop back around to psychoanalysis, Otto Rank in his 1929 book Truth and Reality and its follow-up Will Therapy writes, some refuse the loan of life to avoid the debt of death, which is absolutely clinically true. Its cliché form is that people go through life avoiding making connections with other people out of fear that that relationship might one day end. If it will end and cause pain, I will avoid it from the start. These people, in attempt to prepare themselves in advance for hurt as to maximize the enjoyment of life and the minimization of pain, utilitarianism, end up living hollow, lonely lives devoid of meaning. The safe life is not a good life. Life is about risk, and this is different than constantly engaging in danger. Platitudes aside, and that word is a little too harsh for Jenkinson, what Jenkinson is saying here is that some things do produce negative feelings in us, and rather than protect ourselves by disavowing these feelings through using euphemisms, defenses, etc., we need to allow ourselves to feel them and process them meaningfully. Death can in fact be scary, and it is certainly inevitable. Get in touch with the feelings this produces in us. Jenkinson tells a short story about a terminally ill woman who avoids talking about death, has a mother that does not talk about death, and has a yoga teacher who says she is on the right path, i.e. is avoiding the fact of her impending death. Jenkinson takes the position that it is her duty to accept her death in order to affirm her life. Despite the truth of this, Jenkinson does not realize that a person sometimes needs to rely on a defense against death in order to recuperate some enjoyment before the final act. It is my opinion that Jenkinson gets a little moralistic about things. People should die this or that way, and that life affirmation is for living. A patient who is near death does not necessarily need to affirm life by admitting to their death. However, different therapists will handle these situations in their own ways. In general, the psychoanalytic question would be, does the patient want to live or die? And how do they want to live, die? I, as an analyst, only help people live. When suicidal patients arrive at my office, I work with them until their resistance to living comes to the forefront, or arises in the transference or relationship between himself and myself. Whereupon I ask, would you like to work with me to figure out how to live without wanting to kill yourself? Or, if the patient needs a more containing statement, I might say I only help people who want to live. If you want to figure out how to live, we can do that together. If you want to die, I will help you check into a hospital, or you can find another therapist. I have yet to have any patient who hasn't said yes. This is affirming life while also having feelings about death. What psychoanalysis aims to do, in a way. Entry 16, a polemic for a polemic. A short polemic. A schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying on the analyst's couch. Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus. Perhaps hyperbolic, but it's come to mean psychoanalysis is bad because it substitutes a silly artificial world for a real world. After all, the following line is a breath of fresh air, our relationship with the outside world. Yes. A schizo may be no better off taking a walk rather than lying on the couch and having some stupid Freudian attempt to interpret his word salad. Yes, analytic discourse is to an extent artificial. But a schizo is not better out for a walk if when on this walk he can't pass a stranger without thinking they have read his mind, without thinking that if he locks eyes with someone they surely must be following him, watching him, that if he lets bad thoughts slip into his mind, such as murdering people, that the people he sees as he walks will in fact be murdered, without believing that the world will implode if he does not perform this or that ritual, etc. That is, a clinical schizo cannot enjoy a walk, much anything else. What they need is something artificial because the world is already too real. They are already on the outside, in a relationship with the outside world. Entry 17, Reader requests, Dream Analysis? Silence as an analytic technique? This blog is in part me venting frustration, a cope, as they would say, part me sharing bits of knowledge or experience, if we can posit a difference, that excite me, part me wanting to connect with people and feel as if my knowledge is actually helpful, my desire to teach. This entry is composed entirely of the last item, that is, reader-requested topics, though reader-requested is quite narcissistic of me. 1. Dream Analysis. What's the deal with it within the confines of psychoanalysis? Why has it fallen out of style in contemporary, mainstream psychology? To be brief, Freud discovers dream analysis in the late 1800s, writing in Terp. of Dreams in 1899, superstitionally setting the publishing date to 1900. In this text he analyzes only his own dreams. The thinking on the matter is simple. We aren't conscious of everything that goes on in our body. Our thoughts and feelings are byproducts of our body's natural vital processes. Therefore, theoretically and empirically, we are not fully conscious of all thoughts and feelings, etc. etc. This maps onto everyday experience. Okay. Thus, as is the case with metaphysics, scientific reasoning, criminal investigation, or medical practice, that which is unknowable, unable to be experienced, or in the very least distant from direct knowledge or experience, must be intuited or inferred through evidence. Dreams provide evidence of the unconscious in that their symbols can, not have to, be traced back to everyday experiences the dreamer experienced recently, or thoughts and feelings the dreamer finds meaningful to their life narrative. This marks the first significant time in history that dreams are looked at through a materialist lens, i.e. the body and its processes produce effects that intellectualized, and when stimuli from the outside is reduced to a minimum in sleep, these swirling body sensations are poorly translated into images to which, later, motion and therefore narrative is attributed to. Now, in the 60s-80s a big rift in psychoanalytic dream studies develops. It can be summed up as the positivists versus the hermeneuticists. Positivists, dreams of meaning. Each symbol has a meaning waiting to be discovered. You can map out consistencies between dreams etc. Hermeneuticists, dreams don't take on meaning until the analyzer gives them meaning via the context in which they bring up the dream, and the contexts in which the dream was created, or, until the analyst interprets the dream in a meaningful way that sticks with the analysand. Freud was a little bit of both, which both parties seemed to deny. So, inside a psychoanalysis, dream analysis gets pulled in two directions, i.e. analysis, without a common front, shot itself in the foot here. I'm being a bit dramatic. Analysts just work the way they think works best. Unfortunately, therapy as a whole drifts away from models of meaning-making in the late 70s and early 80s and instead moves towards ego psychology in America, which is much more pragmatic and focused on defenses, and things like CBT, which makes claims to empirical science and behavioral principles to which dreams are part of the black box of the mind which positive statements can't be made regarding. So, outside of psychoanalysis, science and therapy, with their physicalist bias, move away from looking at heady or airy things such as dreams as valid. This move left dreams to fall into the dreaded discursive gap where it was picked up by pop psych, esoterica, and mysticism, dream journals, dream symbol books. 2. Silence as an analytic technique. This one is simple. As I went over earlier in this blog, the analyst utilizes transference to help the analysand in whatever way they want or need help. Transference is when the patient transfers ideas, feelings, assumptions, beliefs, etc. onto the therapist, and the therapist uses these to resolve conflicts and give the patient new emotional maturational experiences. A very superficial but still significant reason an analyst may remain quiet is because the analyst may not yet know what the communication means, or may have an idea of what it means but wishes to let the train of thought or signifiers play out uninterrupted. At conferences I've heard some Lacanians talk about waiting to see who or what other the sentence is supposed to refer to. Object relation analysts want to decipher what internal objects the patient is responding to in themselves and what perceived part object the analyst is. Drive theorists will see what the drives will do when frustrated, ego and self-psychoanalysts will see what kind of defense the patient directs to deal with their unrequited talk, etc. The analyst may be quiet as to reduce stimuli and therefore induce the patient to project onto the therapist their wishes, beliefs, fears, etc. The analyst may also be quiet as to help the patient get in touch with their inner thoughts and feelings, similar to how reduced stimuli, i.e. sleeping, allows the inner processes to feed back off the akatha and form dreams, what Freud referred to as the royal road to the unconscious. Another reason the analyst may keep quiet is to assess character and maturation. When deprived, does the patient ask the therapist to be more active? Does the patient accept this and sulk? Does the patient get mad? These can be clues to the patient's history and how they tended to resolve conflicts across their lifetimes. I give an example, heavily coded as to not betray confidentiality. A patient relays a series of mundane facts about their life but inserts in the middle of these boring facts an alarming anecdote about doing something very dangerous and possibly life-threatening. The patient then continues with boring facts and then goes quiet. We sit in quiet. I observe internally the feeling of frustration. I trace the frustration back to the idea that the patient is trying to provoke me into being worried and losing my cool. I also notice that I don't immediately believe the patient to have done such a crazy and dangerous thing. I wonder what the patient might get out of provoking me. I then wonder if perhaps the patient was doing a dangerous thing and my own narcissism, i.e. wanting to be a good therapist who doesn't have patients who act out so immaturely, is preventing me from feeling the true seriousness of the event. All of this thought exists in my head during the silence. I then break the silence. Should I be worried about you? This should suffice. An entire session would bore. Entry 18, Zizek's Vulgar Marxism Confused for Psychoanalytic Praxis? My most frequent readers send me a quote from a Zizek lecture. The goal of psychoanalysis is precisely to bring you to the point where you can finally forget about that piece of bullshit which is yourself or myself, and finally work for a cause, political, religious, love, etc. As Zizek would say, no violent handshake. Is it not quite the opposite of what is said here? Yes, Ziz is completely incorrect. In a strange move, Ziz invokes a superego injunction in order to substantiate an abstraction that is not felt as a material entity in the body. One should devote one's self to a cause greater than one's self. Psychoanalysis is about analyzing down abstractions and superego injunctions so that one can understand one's own wants and needs, and how they relate to a history of conflict, and therefore one's self. not denigrate oneself. Piece of bullshit. This is not say that there is surely a hard and fast self or unfractured ego, as the Lacanians will show well enough that this is a myth, but rather to say that beneath all the play of signifiers there are real bodies, drives, and affect. If it's one thing Lacanians never understand, and what Freud, André Green, Laplanche, Deleuze and Guattari do, is that there's a body, or material, underneath all the push and pull of lack and signification. Drive theory is overlooked by or rather distorted into a language game. As Nickland writes, if the unconscious is structured like a language, it is only because language has the pattern of a plague. Page 185 FN. Later adding Freud floats upon impersonal flows of desire that erupt out of traumatized nature. Where are the flows in Lacan? Where would one be less likely to find anything that flows than in his texts? Page 283 FN. So, to use Ziz's quote, the goal of psychoanalysis is precisely to bring you to the point where you can finally be in touch with the drives and conflicts that make up the thing we refer to hesitantly as the self, and once this is done, understand what one wants and therefore finally work for a need or want that falls on the side of constructive or life-affirming existence. This can be mean investing this libidinal drive into politics, an ego-sublimated object that should be taken balanced and maturely, religion, a superego-sublimated object that should be done in a life-affirming manner, and love, an id-sublimation that can be done in a meaningful manner. Not as catchy, but Ziz has always sacrificed profundity at the expense of making boop jokes. Okay, for the record, I like Ziz, and he isn't totally wrong. What he really means is that the analyst brings the analysand out of their narcissistic bubble and helps them develop ego strength to the point where they can withstand being in a world with actual people, objects, rather than part objects and the projections we throw onto them. Similarly, elsewhere Ziz makes an equally grievous error when he says, you can't change people, but you can change the system so that people aren't pushed to do certain things. Let's be honest. Zizek isn't really a psychoanalyst. He's a psychoanalytic philosopher. That is, he doesn't see patients, attend supervision, maintain a training analysis, contribute to or at clinical conferences, work at a clinic, etc. etc. In the 60s Lacan made it so that anyone who wanted to be an analyst could train at his institute and, when they were ready, call themselves an analyst. The hole in fights between American psychoanalysts, European psychoanalysts, and French European psychoanalysts is a large bit of history to cover. Think MDs versus PhDs versus Psy.Ds. As someone who actually treats patients, and despite still being in training, I've been seeing patients for 5+ years, which is very small in comparison to analysts who see patients for up to 70 years of their lifetime. I can assure you people do change. Here is the way I will synthesize my experience with Ziz's proclamation and in doing so link it back to the emphasis on drive theory above. Yes, you do have to change the system that pushes people to do things, but that system is internal and it is the system of drives and their vicissitudes. Psychoanalysis does not work on an intellectual level, which Ziz, an obsessional academic, is stuck at as indicated by his approach to theory and the anecdotes that one can find regarding his analysis, if you can call it that. With Miller, it works on an emotional level to resolve conflicts and give patients, as I have said, new emotional and maturational experiences through resolving resistances via transference. Entry 19, Marx and Green, Practice, Theory and Cybernetic Feedback. Popular psychoanalysis has come to be a Marxist theoretical affair, the very nature of which ironically overshadows its possible and already existent practical Marxist aspects. All that is solid melt into air, including Marxism itself, which lapses into commodity fetishism. Polemic meant to evoke notions of Petersonian cultural Marxism? No. Statement meant to highlight that in the 50s-80s psychoanalysis in Europe, with the help of Lacan, came to be attached to Marx and social theory critical of the ego and subject, while at the same time in America psychoanalysis was morphing into the opposite, individualized ego psychology. Also know, though this is helpful to keep in mind, statement meant to provoke a renewed interest in psychoanalytic practice and therefore also a renewed interest in psychoanalytic theory? Yes. Popular psychoanalysis has come to be a CMC cycle that has lost similitude, Foucault, or lost the symbol, Jung. Yes, I'm well aware of the methodological shakiness of mixing discourses like this, as well as the plain irony of talking about Marx through two thinkers, one antithetical to Marx, the other indifferent. We don't need to get lost in theoretical jargon to get at what this means and why it is important. We simply need to provide the following model from which the intelligent reader can synthesize their own meaning. Clinical psychoanalysis has built into it several feedback mechanisms, practices, that hone theory. Theory can then be used to further hone practice, and so on and so on. What does this mean? I'm in a session with a patient. I have a theory or hypothesis regarding the patient, how they feel, what they think, what they want, etc. I test it on my patient by taking my internal thoughts and feelings and forming them thoughtfully into a question or interpretation aloud. As Freud points out in several early papers, an interpretation is only as good as the patient's response to it, whether it takes or not, to use old medical jargon. Even if, as an analyst, you have all these genius ideas of what's going on with the patient, if these ideas don't stick in the transference and help produce a transference conducive to the task of analysis, whatever that task may be, i.e., the conscious or unconscious goals decided upon between analyst and analysand, then your theory is essentially useless. What Guattari meant when he said psychoanalysts need to get a grip and do what works, not what is right. Doctor, use a theory, get feedback from the patient. Hone the theory. The stuff that works sticks with the patient and then sticks, hopefully, with the analysts who communicate with each other at conferences, lectures, classes, supervisions, etc., which are all themselves other feedback mechanisms, and therefore tends to be more likely to stick in the future, self-reinforcing feedback, or is subjected to rigorous critique. Pure theory, which is what Lacan wanted to move analysis towards, for better or worse, does not have this feedback mechanism. Maybe it does in non-positivist epistemological models, but that's another story. Whether or not your theory catches on is essentially up to language games and cult of personality. Can you defeat or persuade your opponent? Academic debates disconnected from material circumstances, real people and their actual experiences. For example, theoretical psychoanalysts who don't see patients take film and cultural events as their object of analysis. These objects cannot provide feedback to an interpretation. The object can be endlessly manipulated intellectually to fit the model, and the model can be manipulated to fit the event, which is one latent critique D&G Levy towards Freud in his treatment of the Wolfman and his conceptualization of Schroeder. Never will Vertigo reply back to Zizek, "No, you get me all wrong, I don't feel that way at all." Just an example, I like Zizek's analysis of Vertigo. This gets us to Andre Green's astute observation that, in simple terms, psychoanalysis is the only field wherein practice is theory and theory is practice, or what Marx was trying to get at in reconnecting theory to material. D and G, form and content are interchangeable. McLuhan, the medium is the message. Baudrillard, the simulation and the hyperreal. Nick Land and Mark Fisher, theory fiction and hyperstition, etc. Green, in an interview in 1994 says, "An exceptional intelligence and the ability to produce some very interesting works do not necessarily imply his adherence to the psychoanalytical experience. In psychoanalysis, we are committed to an alliance between practice and theory. We cannot regard a psychoanalyst in the same way we regard a philosopher. A philosopher's only concern is himself and other philosophers. A psychoanalyst must also deal with people outside his field." How is it, you might ask, that someone who for 7 years was an associate and an admirer of Lacan could suddenly abandon him, and become one of his foes? Green talking about himself, my answer is that it requires time to completely deconstruct Lacan's theoretical mechanism and to relate it to his practice in general. At the time, I limited myself to a kind of compromise. I said, I cannot approve of your practice, but your theory interests me. Only in 1984 did I realize that theory and practice were considerably more interwoven than one would have thought. It is impossible to say, his practice was debatable, but his writing is sound. The comparison between Lacan and Heidegger doesn't work. We cannot say that Heidegger's practice is Nazism. Insofar as he is a philosopher, his thought originates from texts. But you cannot put the psychoanalyst in a similar position. He is responsible for the patients in his care. Every now and then I see some couch-scarred patients, people who have undergone all sorts of abuse by Lacanian analysts. Here we are not talking about theories. And patients have to pay for this. This is their practice, this is how they earn their living. As analysts, how we think informs how we act. How we act also helps us inform how we think. The takeaway here is not another polemic against Lacan. I quite like Lacan, to an extent, and can also entertain the idea that Green is kind of an asshole with his own biases. Green had nasty things to say about my own analyst, completely dismissed D and G. He is an MD and MD analysts are notoriously hateful towards non-MD fields, etc. etc. But that we should start thinking critically about what we think psychoanalysis is, and we should be suspicious of the sort of cottage industry of Lacanian Marxist theoretical stuff that pours off the conveyor belts of critical theory presses, not to mention the psychoanalysts behind these texts who have never sat with a patient in their lives. Entry 20, André Green and the Work of the Negative, Drives, Objects, and Metapsychology. Drive and object. A distinction between drive derivative, invested energy that has become distorted, and drive, semi-mentalized internal motivating force, is important. In the Work of the Negative, Green emphasizes how a drive is always conditioned by an object, not unlike how in physics the plane of space is conditioned by an object, meaning therefore that the drive derivative always contains object traces. Mother was too cold, drive went inwards. Father was too competitive, drive was stunted or frustrated at every turn. Metapsychological cybernetic positive feedback. X, drive invests in Y, object. Y, object becomes tied to X, drive, XY. Object, Y, and drive, X, break off from drive and turn into drive unit, XY. XY is then used to retrospectively determine drive and object, templexity, order and reterritorialization. For Freud, a drive is always latent, as opposed to manifest. We only experience a drive as it appears in an object investment or some other kind of secondary or derivative fashion, never in a pure state, not unlike Kant's thing in itself. Drive derivative is basically character, or what drive theorists would call drive organization. Drives became arranged in a certain way, or the manner and matter of discharge has taken on certain tendencies, libidinal avenues, etc. It is also similar to what Guattari calls an assemblage of enunciation. The play of dynamic forces leaves a residue that becomes the subject or site, Whitehead's superject. The drive and its object impressions are bound up with the notion of negation. Drive and negation. Freud's ideas on negation, see his early paper on negation, are not Hegel's, as Green points out. There is no pure negative, or rather, the negative is always a derivative of a positive. There is always something active occurring. The mind and body are primed to go and are met with resistance which they must overcome, a sort of pseudo-vitalism. Aside, there is a valid point of criticism here, however. There is honest negation which, though still derivative of a positive value, is not indicative of repressed content. As Zizek, referring to this paper, points out in a lecture, with Freud's at times overbearing authoritarian interpretive style, the patient may have been left feeling unheard, not really listened to. Imagine sitting on a couch and knowing Freud is going to find some way to make what you say about your parents. To an anxious neurotic, this might induce a feeling of wanting to make sure Freud really hears you. Doctor, please don't just take this next bit to be about my mother or something. Please listen to what I have to say. Furthermore, we need to add in the layers of defense in the patient's reports. The contemporary psychoanalytic patient, who has undoubtedly been exposed to the Freudian or psychoanalytic clichés as cultural jokes in the very least, may use a negation simply to throw the analysis of her trail. This is done unconsciously, of course. Let me use myself as an example. I don't actually do this as far as I know. Say I really have a problem with my father, but I say this next story has nothing to do with my mother at all. It's about my dad, and then I start talking about my dad. Perhaps your analytic ear has gotten stuck on the first negation. Don't think of mother, as the trained patient knows, perhaps if only unconsciously, that this negation will trigger a certain response in the analyst. Now, your mind is on the mother. This story must have something to do with the mother, which is why he felt the need to negate it from the start. The fake problem presented as the real problem, while I talk about the father, the real problem presented as the fake problem. This is precisely what is dealt with in Lacan's analysis of the purloined letter. However, Lacan seriously leads psychoanalysis astray by reading more Hegel into Freud than there really was, and thereby wedding psychoanalysis to French linguistics and the dialectic of the negative as lack. Though returning to Freud, Lacan clearly departs from Freud, for as we see in the negation paper, Freud's idea of negation is that it has to do with a primary positive. Back to the idea at hand. Once outside the womb, the drive is always tied to an object insofar as the drive presses for discharge and is either met with an object which can contain it and work with it, or met with an obstructive object which frustrates the drive, or still worse, no object at all in the case of the adult who does not heed the infant's call, or heeds it too late, thus imprinting into the infant the subjective feeling that the world is not going to heed the cry. The way the drives are navigated in these early stages, with the early objects, constitutes in large what Green calls the work of the negative: repression, negation, disavowal, foreclosure, etc. These are all the mechanisms of defense we use to either deal with something not being, Mom never came when I cried, or being but not being pleasant, Mom came but was emotionally absent, etc. He calls this process of transforming early experiences into narratives how one negativizes the negative. The absence of the mother turns into not an absence of a mother in the object relations and drive vicissitudes, but rather, precisely a present bad mother. Absence is filled in with a further negative, the bad mother, =/+. Or, in a different way of negativizing the negative, absence is repressed altogether. It's not that I had a bad mom and that's why I am fucked up, but rather, I have no clue why I am fucked up, i.e., hysterical symptomology like blindness or paralysis, etc. Death drive topos and metapsychology. Put crudely, give a person enough negativized negatives and they'll become sickly, inhabited with a morose thanatos. To this effect, the death drive is not an energetic negative force as much as it is a turning away or rejection of the object, as the object is, strictly following the emergence of fantasized and hallucinated objects, that is, by its nature always disappointing and potentially threatening, the latter especially to the infant's feeling, fantasy, of omnipotence. That is, the object, in addition to being associated with dangerous loss, always puts a limit, think Kantian categories and their filtering of the outside, on the feeling of endlessness and power of the infant. Therefore it is, in a limited sense, castrating. Green, page 226, writes, Freud concludes the exposition, dual drive theory, by extending the activity of the death drive to the state of the organism after orgasm, eros having been eliminated through the discharge of the satisfaction obtained. The concessions to the death drive may seem exorbitant. Does the activity of Eros really just shrink away? For sure, on this point we are faced with Freud at his most speculative. Freud the metaphysician, in spite of himself. The experienced absences of early infancy, and this language is tentative as the infant does not experience absence as much as they experience an overwhelming presence of internal dysregulation, i.e., too hungry no food, dirty diaper, or a million other things, which comes to be signified later by absence, come to color all drive configurations. That is, the lost object or bad object colors all drive attachments from that point onward. The field of mind is itself a depression, just as in vulgar pop physics the existence of objects affects the grid of space and time. This is why good and bad objects, i.e. Kleinian theory, as concepts are misnomers. The object isn't good or bad, subjective values that the infant cannot fathom, but rather, the object is or is not. These are spatio-temporal parameters, Kant and Topos, D and G's factory floor blueprint as opposed to representational model or mind as theatre, i.e. McDougall, that better correspond to the way a primitive infant experiences the world. The infant moves to experience, and as developmental psychology shows us, infants tend to be highly oriented to special dimensions from birth. Consistent with Laplanche's work in New Fundamentals of Psychoanalysis, for Green there is no pre-object or objectless phase. There is always an object that is required for survival. It may not be understood by the infant as an object, but it is an object nonetheless. Furthermore, negation and non-object relations, what we might call narcissistic transference in the room where the analyst does not feel he or she exists, is precisely a relation of non-relating, what D and G may call disjunctive synthesis, where the very act of not relating is what indicates that you exist in the room. If you really didn't exist to the other, we may not be filled with the feeling that we don't exist. As Green explicating Freud points out, the object is always somewhat disruptive, disappointing, and hated for both putting an end to the infant's feeling of omnipotence and also always bringing into being a sense of non-immediate gratification, part of what Lacan will call ACK. This means, as Freud points out, that a non-anthropomorphic form of sadism is evident at birth. The infant hates the object. The fantasy of the object is better. So, sadism is hate of the O/outside before there is an idea the O/are. When the infant gets a sense of alterity, sadism may be put into the outside, the other, and then reflected back at the self. Masochism is sadism with the self as object. This puts masochism and sadism back in the economic structure. This also gets us from the reality principle, death drive, primary sadism, to the reality principle, ego and superego, i.e. identifications with others, to the pleasure principle, libido, invested and gaining pleasure from being sadistic to others, or identifying as others and being sadistic to the self. Thus, rather than life, death drive or bad, good objects, Green introduces us to objectization, de-objectization. De-objectization is an attack on object relations and a withdrawal of investment in objects, which Green compares his idea to Bian's attack on links and Lacan's breakdown of the signifying chain. This is partly because objectization is equated with symbolization, the ability to make sense, and links and signifier chains are about making sense out of datum. In the de-objectized subject, a schizophrenic for example, it is not so much a pathological splitting process that lies at the genesis of the schizophrenia, but rather the veritable lack of any sort of splitting process, because splitting implies, to a more or lesser degree, some level relationship with an object, whereas a veritable lack of splitting implies a complete withdrawal into the self, part of which means a rejection of the other, the object. The split is disavowed, which removes the need for an object, and thus an encounter with an object is taken off the table, so to speak. This he calls negative narcissism, which is a moving towards a 0 point. Death drive, sex, and love. Green is at his most Freudian here. The death drive is related to sublimation. Sublimation is the sexual drive becoming desexualized and repressed or invested elsewhere. This investment or repression is related to the superego, and the superego is related to identification, often with that of the father during the Oedipal situation. When libido, that which binds, is spread out, thus becoming to an extent unbinding, and invested through identification, relatively external, and subsequent superego agency, relatively internal model of external identification, opens up space for the death drive to thrive. This is so because the process of sublimation, gratification is delayed, satisfaction is deferred, i.e. the Oedipal father's prohibition and the unavailability of the mother, the subsequent identification and internal agency, opens up furthered investment in frustrating and disappointing objects, reality. This is of course where the Oedipal castration comes into play. It is not the father that castrates, but the very existence of an object and reality that terminates the infant's fantasy of omnipotence. So, for Freud, sublimation equals desexualization equals diffusion or spreading out of libido coupled with objects, and diffusion means that the libido can no longer keep the death drive in check, which means the death drive takes predominance. Naturally, all these drive theory has implications on many aspects of life such as love. The fear people have when in romantic relationships isn't really about abandonment or some wish for death. It's a fear of being the other's object of desire, which is further complicated by the fact that any act of closeness or love unconsciously arouses the spite and vengeance towards the original object which, despite its best efforts, is always disappointing. Sharing, loving, pleasure, tolerance, etc. cannot be created in us by an object alone. An internal drive is always required. These drives get mixed up when we are in romantic relationships. People think they are achieving satisfaction of their own drives when they've really resigned themselves to leaving their drives unsatisfied while getting enjoyment out of satisfying their couple's drives. That is, you believe you are being fulfilled in a relationship, but you have sacrificed your own fulfillment for the fulfillment of the other, which masks itself as fulfillment of yourself. A repetition compulsion of the early Winnicott falls, true self-conflict. In short, object love does not facilitate drive autonomy. Being loved precludes one from the risk of loving another and the important maturational event of realizing that the object is already partially lost. This is part of the function of the analytic situation. The analytic situation is negative. The analyst is quiet, out of sight, in order to bring out positive symptoms. Green writes, instead of searching for it actively, it turns out to be no better to arrange things in such a way that it reveals itself spontaneously. This is the invention of analysis, page 164. To prepare us for getting back to psychoanalysis in general, and in relation to this negative-positive dichotomy, here are the values of psychoanalysis. Representation over perception. We model the outside and use the model to mediate the outside. Psychic reality over external reality. The former is an articulation of the later, but it is all we know of the later. Absence over presence. Symptoms lie in or are generated from absence. Psychoanalysis identifies and interprets symptoms. Memory over presentation. What in literature they would call an unreliable narrator. Fantasy over observable world. Our model and our unreliable narration, our psychic reality, is bound up with imagining the object of our desire, often in a way that is flush with the world that might grant us such an object. Entry 21, OCD. There's a lot of jargon in the media about what it means to have mental illness. OCD is one of those mental illnesses that people colloquially claim to have. Oh, I'm so OCD. Let's throw out everything we know about OCD and start over. Forget it. What is OCD? Obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessing is just what you would think it is: ruminating, get stuck on ideas, being unable to stop thinking certain intrusive thoughts, etc. Compulsion is the feeling that you have to do something in relation to the obsession. Disorder means it gets in the way of your everyday life. Nothing more, nothing less. The stereotypical OCD case? Excessive hand washing. The thought one cannot shake is that one's hands are dirty, filthy, infected. The compulsion is that due to that thought something needs to be done to negate that thought, i.e. washing. The psychoanalytic insight is simply, why is it that the patient is able to cognitively and intellectually understand that their hands are not dirty, that cleaning them to that extent in fact damages them, but that they are still driven to commit the obsessive-compulsive impulse? The answer to the insight is that the superficial phenomenon is a symptom of a deeper conflict. Here's a few deep conflicts based on theory and my own clinical experiences. To understand the symptom, let's split the obsession from the compulsion and explore each one and its related deep conflict. Obsession is often about controlling things beyond our control. I know because I used to be an obsessive, more on this later. The narrative, whether conscious or not, is if I just think hard enough about this, if I just figure it all out in my head, then the uncomfortable reality I can't tolerate will dissipate or change. It's a matter of trying to replace or manipulate reality, the outside, by hyperfocusing on the inside, fantasy. This stems from the early stages of infancy where the infant, unconsciously, and in a mode of pre-thought, believes, we need to disinvest all these terms of their anthropomorphic overtones, that they can control the outside world, the mother's breast and its nutrition, her comfort, etc. If you don't buy this, extend the age to 1.5 to 3 years where potty training starts. It is common that obsessional behavior is associated to anal retentive behavior, wanting to control what comes in and out of the body, wanting to control who, parents or self, gets to decide where someone does what, poop on floor or in toilet. Take 3 to 7 years. Agency issues, power struggles between reality and fantasy, between adults and children continue. Agency is constantly stripped from the child that wishes to be able to contain within it the ability to give itself pleasure. Mother's breast gives me pleasure. I wish to contain mother's breast. Food gives me pleasure. I wish to be able to produce my own food. This last wish, self-sustaining production in body, producing food, producing shit, gets us to another aspect of obsession, the reaction formation to intrusive thoughts. Thoughts become intrusive because they are regular natural thoughts but are guarded against by the ego and superego, i.e. the prohibitions the parents put upon the child and how those prohibitions get internalized into the child. For example, the wish to poop and eat one's own poop, which many troubled children will actually do, turns into a reaction formation, a sort of opposite, that of intense fear of filth and a fear that one is dirty. To this effect, and synthesizing our previous idea, above about control and reality, it is important to highlight that OCD is often an attempt to control or dismiss intrusive thoughts are in themselves reflections of a disturbing reality. Think away bad thoughts, think away reality. Compulsions arrive on the scene when one somewhat unconsciously becomes aware of the fact that thinking alone will not get one out of the discomfort and frustration of reality. Action is then imposed to discharge the discomfort of the failed attempt at abolishing the discomfort. For a quick and dirty connection to reality, how was I an obsessive and why does it matter? I believed for many years, without knowing it, that if I did well enough at school, was smart enough, had good enough arguments, that I could change others or the world. What a narcissistic, omnipotent fantasy. How did this affect my life? I couldn't allow myself to experience reality, true outsideness as opposed to what Nick Land calls alterity in advance, i.e. narcissism, and part of my obsession prevented me from accepting reality as it was, and as a result I was often disappointed and resentful. No need to say more than this, and that part of what helped me was learning, through emotional experiences, that I can't control the outside and that any and all thoughts and feelings I have are okay. No need to moralize. I'm gonna roll this reader suggestion into another reader suggestion. Diagnosis. OCD is a diagnosis. Why diagnosis? Tune in next time. Entry 22, Group Psychology and Herd Morality. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud illustrates the following: within a group, the responsibility of the individual vanishes due to the sense of anonymity. I can do something and get away with it, others are acting the same way so I don't stand out, etc. Mob rule. This, coupled with widespread emotional contagion whereby feelings in the self are experienced as being in the other as well, something which intensifies affect to a fever pitch, creates a sort of group mind. This loss of responsibility and subsequent identification with others, along with the heightened affect, leads to a letting down of repressive, inhibitive defenses and therefore to more freely mobilized instinctual action. In sociological terms, certain risks and behaviors are legitimized as the threat of receiving critical or shaming responses by peers. Authority is lessened due to the alignment of values between group members. If we all agree that X is permissible, X is less likely to be an action, idea which warrants exile or attack from the group, and therefore is less inhibited, prohibited and threatening to the self. Put simply, feelings are heightened while moral, second-order self-administered adjustments to behavior, responsibility and intellectual activity are lowered. Though, paradoxically, as the primal instincts rise with natural and spontaneous moral inhibition falling away, what people tend to do that makes societies work, mutual self-interest and cooperation, a disintegration anxiety arises related to the more freely mobilized instincts and their threat of self-destructive or in-group violence. If we are all charged up and ready to do something bad, this could quickly turn into Hobbes' state of nature. We could turn on each other, and thus a desire to reassert a minimum sense of unity therefore also arises. This takes the form of a new group morality through a libidinal investment in an actual person, intellectual, general, prophet, daddy, Führer, etc., or an idea, ideology, any form of narrative centrality even if that centrality emphasizes decentrality. This is a positively framed investment, a cornerstone idea or leader. This need for discharging violent tension while also maintaining a sense of unity, sometimes explicitly moral, sometimes implicitly, also takes a negatively framed investment, that of an unconscious move towards a structure of reifying, homogenizing, and normalizing internal group beliefs while aiming violence outward, at someone outside the group, someone other than us, another or out-group. The basic idea is that a person or group of people outside of the group is used to direct in-group intolerable feelings outwards. This serves the function of preserving the homogeneity of the group through removing the negative factor, destructive in-group violence, while at the same time interspersing a positive factor into the neutral gap created by the recently removed negative factor. This positive factor is a unifying cause in which the group can bond over, strengthening their ties, in primitive psych terms, an internal loved object and external hated object, other. Thus, in a Freudian stew of contiguous process, non-contradictory, Freud's kettle logic, Deleuze and Guattari's schizo position, we arrive at an enjoyable moral position of hatred towards someone outside the group, another. Here, the reader may have an initial reaction. How is hatred of another for no objective reason a moral position? It's not a constructive ethical position, but it is one that is grounded in what one group would of other groups believe to be indisputable moral superiority. Entry 23, Notes on Diagnosis. Diagnosis is a strange thing for mental health, illness. It is well known in clinical circles, psychoanalytic or otherwise, that it isn't always helpful to diagnose a patient transparently, or talk to a patient about their diagnosis. Why? The patient begins to consciously or unconsciously identify with the label and symptoms that were previously not present appear. Or patients try to take matters into their own hand and seek internet cures. In short, diagnosis can reinforce illness. So what, after all, is the purpose of diagnosis? Diagnosis, like most mental health concepts, comes from the medical model. A physician diagnoses their patient as to better know how to proceed with a treatment or cure. That is, a diagnosis is a byproduct of conversation between practitioners who have shared their resonate findings. So and so displayed X and in most cases Y worked to help X. A finding that is verified by 6 out of 10, give or take, other people with similar situations. Therefore X can be called diagnosis X, which means when someone has X they can be treated with Y. So, diagnosis is a concept based on a community of positivist scientists sharing information about likelihoods and probabilities. Diagnostic methods like these, positivist ones, worked in the early 19th and 20th centuries. Given the state of technology, collective cultural knowledge traveled less overall. When it did travel, it traveled less distance and suffered from much more information degradation, and when it did travel despite its lessened distance and information quality, it was believed if it was consistent with prevailing knowledge. Now, in our technologically advanced, postmodern era, information travels worldwide often with little to no noticeable degradation or lag. At the same time, information can constantly be challenged. The marketplace of information is oversaturated and offers all kinds of alternative beliefs, and the authority of the source of information can always be compared and contrasted with other sources. In short, unified authority, for better or for worse, is dead and techno-global fragmentation is in. This change in authority affects the function of diagnosis. Before, the narrative was something like, if the doctor says I have X and Y is helpful, then I will follow the treatment and do Y. So when Freud asked questions, you answered. When Freud gave an interpretation, you made sense of it and believed it. Now, when the doctor says something, you check WebMD, or, considering culture has undermined the concept of authority, one has recourse to an even softer, more elusive resistance. That's not what my family does, or even softer, that's not my experience. Some combination of all of these may be sought in the form of seeking a second opinion, which can either be a good move or get one tangled up in the infights between disciplinary or financial rivals. This shift in how people think about and respond to authority is present in the literature in the form of the rising interest in treating narcissistic disorders, as seen in the modern psychoanalytic schools of Vermont, Boston, and New York, and the self and ego psychologists of Chicago and the East Coast. Considering, as I have pointed out here and elsewhere in an upcoming article for the MVU and a recent podcast with Cooper Cherry, psychoanalysis in large works through creating a hermeneutic loop between the analyst and analysand, where meaning is created very locally in the room between the mind of the analyst and the words and actions of the analysand. As Bion, a Kantian interested in epistemology, showed, the analyst makes sense out of the analysand's talk and relays the sense back to the patient. Knowledge and meaning is created in the relationship between the two people. This renders the concept of a diagnosis relatively useless in both its functions as a shared understanding about predictability and as a way of conveying to a patient what they need to do to get better. This is why, for better or for worse, diagnosis is a second-order afterthought. After treatment is over, an analyst may say to a friend or colleague, "Ah yes, I had a patient just like that, and here's how things ended up." If there is a takeaway here, it is both that one should not identify with a diagnosis and not rely on a diagnosis, and also not trust the vulgar anti-psychiatric discourse that looks to disparage the underlying hope of diagnosis. Entry 24, Short Fragmented Notes on Lacan's Mirror Stage. Lacan begins with the notion that the psychoanalytic formation of the I or ego, a sense of self, is opposed to the philosophical notion of the cogito, which, though Lacan does not explicitly mention, is the Cartesian notion that there is a purely thinking substance or a sort of essential mental thing separate to the body that can objectively observe the body and external world. Page 502. For Lacan, the I comes out of an ontological, page 503, structural process of reflection, what he calls a symbolic matrix, ibid, wherein a real body is perceived by itself, the real eyes, the perception signal of which is sent back into the real body, creating an imago, a representation on the inside of what appears on the outside. Echoing back to Lacan's example of a monkey, page 502, this process is related to ethology, as it is a sort of human mimicry with itself, rather than the way an animal mimics another animal to learn a gesture. To this effect, Lacan writes that the imago, mentalized idea of the body as known through reflection in the mirror, acts to establish a relation between the outer, biophysical organism, what in early Lacan is the real, and the inner, imaginary and symbolic realm, page 505. Through this process, the fragments of the body must be integrated into a whole. The infant moves in jerking motions, noticing a possibly lag between his body and his wish for what his body should do. She moves her arm, and the minimal ontological gap between immediate outer action and less than immediate inner process allows for the self-reflective notion that body parts are just that, parts which are sometimes semi-autonomous of the controlling ego. Next, the ego or I which is coming into being through this mirroring comes to be connected to, as a now invested concept. There is a me, I am this person, the need to defend this ego arises, I am me, and I shouldn't be fragmented as that is scary, the fear of breakdown or schizophrenia, so I should keep myself whole from a scary outside. From this arises paranoia. One may think again of paranoid schizophrenia, others are out to get me and get rid of my sense of a whole self. From paranoia arises jealousy via an inversion of the paranoia, I am paranoid of you, you threaten me, thus I want whatever it is I lack that fills me with the feeling of being threatened by you. If only I had what you had, I would be truly complete and not threatened, and thus omnipotent. Then, desire, filling the perceived lack, protecting the self, becomes entangled in the other, or object petty A, page 505-507. The mirroring process has now come full circle. Through a mirror a sense of self emerged, through the eyes of another the sense of self is entrenched and reinforced. Entry 25. Notes on mental illness, drive theory, and reality TV. In the entry before the last, I commented briefly on the heuristics of diagnosis. What I didn't touch on there, and what is a long-standing issue in psychoanalysis and its related psychiatric fields, is the discussion of whether or not mental illness is real or not. It's a poorly framed question. Even mistakes, errors, lies, etc., are real, to some degree, unreal, hyperreal, etc. So what does it mean when we ask if mental illness is real? We mean to say, is the concept of mental illness functional in its goal of understanding people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to the extent that it can be used to aid people who want aid, or give insight to other care providers? The question is whether it helps or hurts. Along these lines, Thomas Szasz, who denies being an anti-psychiatrist, but for our purposes here can be considered about as close to one as one can get, famously asserted that mental illness is a myth. Since then, social critics, postmodernists, post-structuralists, etc., Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari, R.D. Lane, all riding the anti-psychiatrist wave, have towed this line one way or another. Let's switch gears for a second. I've been watching a lot of reality TV love shows with my girlfriend, such as the UK's Love Island and the US's Love is Blind. How is this related? Watch these shows and you will no longer question whether or not mental illness is real. In Love is Blind, people go on literal blind dates. That is, they meet many people but are obscured by a barrier from seeing one another. Eventually they must decide, based only on their conversations and sound of voice, which person they want to choose to marry, at which point they meet in person and reveal their physical appearance to their new fiancé. Obviously, this can cause conflicts. The person I got to know and like talking with is not physically appealing to me. What no? Kind of conflicts. For example, we watch Jessica struggle with being unattracted to her choice. Unfortunately for Jessica, she seems completely unable to have any insight into her conflict, which results in very strange behavior. Jessica appears unable to tell her partner she does not find him attractive except in ways that are totally cruel, followed by a guilty retraction of her statements, or sometimes a complete denial she even said that. For example, she tells her partner that she finds him second best to another man whom she finds sexy and attractive, only to laugh off and reject this sexy man when he approaches her asking if she is interested in him. She smiles when she is angry, a forced smile that seems to indicate she cannot tolerate her own anger. Incongruent effect, she fails to synthesize contrasting ideas or feelings, such as joyfully pronouncing the beauty of a dress while also saying it feels wrong and crying. All of this would be okay if Jessica seemed to have some insight into her rapidly fluctuating feelings, but she seems to really believe each contrasting feeling or idea in that moment, only to switch, seemingly without noticing she had previously felt differently, to the opposite feeling or idea. We could talk more about others, such as Jessica's partner, who seems to intuitively understand that Jessica does not have any interest in him, yet still insists that they are on the same page without asking Jessica if she is, in fact, on the same page as him, but we get the idea. This is mental illness in the flesh. Jessica, and her partner, seemingly gets nothing of what she wants or needs from whatever game she is unconsciously playing out with these men. It seems she is unable to allow herself to have feelings one might think reasonable to have given the circumstances, and it seems she drastically lacks continuity in her feeling states and ideations. In clinical jargon, she seems to lack a stable ego, she seems fragmented. The idea, at least for Freud, is the materialist hypothesis that the mind is an extension of the body, an attempt to transform bodily forces, instincts, functions, processes, into symbols. We have all kinds of instincts, some of which are socially acceptable, some of which are not. Therefore, as social animals, we are in conflict between our body and its needs and our outer world. In addition to these internal stimuli that always exert pressure, there are external stimuli, social pressures, other people and their wants and needs, Sartre as hell as other people, etc., that create further conflict. For Freud, and Nietzsche, when an internal or external stimuli presents itself, one needs to act with one's body accordingly, otherwise one suppresses the instinct unnaturally, throwing the body out of cycle. However, because we live in a society, to reference the great meme, we cannot always act on our instincts, and therefore we must find alternative ways of discharging the instinct. This way is through talking. Instead of doing, we talk about how we feel and what we would like to do. This helps develop narrative continuity, ego, and provide a higher feeling of relief than not acting and not talking. In short, if you are not getting what you need or want, or rather, your own thoughts, feelings, or behaviors are preventing you from getting what you need or want, and you are unable to recognize how you feel and how your feelings shift in relation to your instinctual responses to internal and external situations, all of which result in conflict, and if you are unable to resolve this conflict and it further impedes your getting what you need or want, and if this feedback cycle feedbacks out of control and becomes commonplace to the extent that it impedes personality or dynamic response to the world, then you are experiencing mental illness. This is what, in clinical jargon, is called a personality disorder. You wouldn't use the same tool to approach all tasks, would you? Then why would you use the same limited responses, give or take, for all situations? But these metaphors run the risk of preachy cognitive behavior. We don't want this. With this in mind, and if we don't like the terminology, given it is harsh, almost critical, we could always say mental dynamism challenged or those with dynamic difficulty. You think I'm being cheeky? I am not. This is what mental illness is. Conflicts over dynamism. Entry 26, Getting the Juices Flowing Again. It's been a while. It's been a while because I am sick to death of psychoanalysis. 24 to 40 hours of work at the clinic, 12 to 15 hours in the private practice, 3 hours of supervision and 3 hours of analysis or so a week. Not to mention class. That's over 60 hours of thinking, feeling, analyzing, etc. It's exhausting. By the end of the week the last thing I want to do is write about it. Enough of my whining. I am back to say two things. 1. All that psychoanalysis amounts to is the idea that people have thoughts and feelings about things that happen, and for many reasons people are not permitted to honestly express these thoughts and feelings, and thus they experience subjective conflict that affects behavior, intentions, motivations, etc. You can forget all the fancy structural and post-structural theory, all the appeals to this or that form of authority, all the muddy concepts. And just remember that psychoanalysis is a theory of conflict. It is pragmatic, and experience near. 2. A good Twitter friend and frequent reader of the blog has suggested I write something on production, specifically the emphasis many cultures place on the need to be productive. We see it in the gurus and snake oil salesmen of our time, YouTubers obsessively documenting how they make the most of every minute, how to maximize, optimize, etc. Why? The simple answer, one that may be right but neglects psychodynamics, is that it's a very basic biological mastery enjoyment circuit. Developmental psychologists talk about how the child learns to have healthy self-esteem, and work towards goals, i.e., live and enjoy life as opposed to becoming mentally ill at an early age. It involves the child developing a sense of mastery over its environment. The child learns how to manipulate its body as to manipulate its world, and from this it gets positive feedback, either from itself in the form of a feeling of being able to change or experiment with objects, get nutrition, play, etc., or from others who encourage behavior, which reinforces positive self-image, which translates to I am someone in this world who can do something meaningful. Vignette: a young boy asks his older brother if he can help with the dishes. The older brother gladly gives up the task which for him is tedious. The younger child reaps enjoyment from the basic task, the basic feeling of being able to do something in the world. Productivity, or maximizing manipulation, as in corporeal, the using of the digits, the body, the moving of objects, not emotional manipulation, of self and other, is a way of ensuring the most enjoyment out of the least work, which is a basic biological function, one that is consistent with healthy growth. We learn to economize our thought and behavior as to get smarter and stronger. This is so far all on the register of ego and id, if we are to use Freud's topological model. Id are our impulses and instincts we are born with as an animal organism, ego is the mediating surface, the thing we think has agency which figures out how to process the id. However, things get more complicated when we introduce the superego. The superego becomes fixated on not only ensuring enjoyment is achieved in a certain way, i.e., a good and proper way. Boy is scolded by brother or parents for washing the dishes too fast and thereby not washing them well, but also by maximizing enjoyment as to not feel guilt for wasting time. In other words, the child develops a mastery enjoyment circuit through self and other given positive feedback, but as the child grows, the child must modify this mastery enjoyment circuit by navigating negative feedback, things that he cannot control, and boundaries, criticism from the parents, which can result in feelings. In another post I will elaborate on why I don't consider them feelings, of guilt and shame, or behaviors and thought processes meant to avoid criticism, projection, delusions, etc. This, of course, is in full force in potty training where the child's productive forces, peeing, shitting, are curbed and limited to certain times and places. Impulse control. TL, Dr. A general psychoanalytic perspective on the pressure to be productive would necessarily take into account the basic enjoyment of producing, and the way superego injunctions, or law, modify this enjoyment process. And if we were to be reductive Freudians, just for the fun, fuck, of it, we would have to describe the pressure to be productive as a sublimation or synthesis of the id impulse to produce shit and piss, the ego drive to achieve mastery, master potty training, and the superego wish to please and follow rules, not be wasteful with time. Entry 27, Some Notes on Dream Analysis as Materialism. One morning I stirred from my sleep for a few moments, slightly awake, only to fall back asleep. Upon falling back to sleep I had an interesting dream. Sitting in a meadow, I could feel sun warm on my face intermittently cooled by a fragrant mist. Sun showers, my favorite weather phenomenon, filling my eyes with glint and my ears with the calming drone of white noise that only rainfall can generate. Cradled by calm comfort. A peaceful dream. So what produced such a nice dream for me? Well, precisely after waking up, and right before falling back asleep, in my brief waking period, I remember feeling the warm comfort of my blankets, looking to my right, through my shades and seeing the morning sun begin to peek over the treetops while at the same time hearing the sound of the bathroom fan from my left. My dream is a synthesis of these disparate events, disparate sensorily, temporally, and spatially. For Freud, the body's material processes and how those processes produce feedback through the body's own system, and how that is then translated into affects, thoughts, and feelings. Body is in need of nutrition, stomach produces signals, signals are felt as a grumble or as a hunger pang is translated into feeling, perhaps frustration at hunger, or conscious or unconscious thought, I should eat, etc. is the engine that fuels all mental processes. From this it follows in Freud's theory of dreams that the mind creates a narrative or a story to make sense of the senses that arise from the body. A story is a symbolic grid that pulls together disparate elements, an assemblage of enunciation. Here, in my situation, I briefly experienced disparate, disconnected sensory experiences, the sound of a fan, the sight of sun, the feel of warm blankets on my skin, and upon falling back asleep, my mind synthesized these disparate elements into a story. I was laying comfortably and warmly in a meadow, sense of touch and blankets, during a sun shower, sense of sight and sun plus sound of bathroom fan that reminded me of sound of rain. I like sun showers. I always have. I have not analyzed why, but if I had been a different person, perhaps these disparate sensory experiences would be synthesized into a different mental story. For whatever reason, the positive memory or experience of a sun shower served as a symbolic grid pulling these disparate sense experiences together. When a psychoanalyst analyzes a dream, he or she is looking to trace back the story to its sensory experiences, and the symbolic grid that underlies it. Part of the reason why asking what feeling did you have directly upon waking up is a good diagnostic question to ask. Entry 28, Blog Reader Response. Cool Twitter follower Jens, @Gently, asks, how is psychoanalysis different from the pursuit of self-knowledge via diving into your past experience, noticing your feelings and journaling? What tools does it have that the latter doesn't possess? Another comment-to-response transference? This commenter is right. But this answer is not likely to convince Jens. I share a clinical vignette before delving into theoretical mumbo-jumbo. Patient, I keep putting in job applications and not getting calls back. I bet they. Patient devolves into a paranoid theory of how the job hirers must be hiring people with money or connections over him, etc. Me, have you tried calling back? Patient, no, I haven't. Me, if you'd like to test your theory that you are being neglected due to not having connections or money, then you might want to try calling back and seeing if you can't get an interview. Similarly, later in the session, all my friends are successful in job field. I'm in the same field and I can't seem to be as successful as them. It must be because patient devolves into a paranoid theory of how, why and how these people have achieved success, etc. Me, Have you tried asking them what makes them successful instead of theorizing to me about it? You have these people as a resource. They are your friends. They will answer you. Why not ask them? Like it or not, most people are like this patient. If left to their own devices they, not unlike narcissism staring into his pool, would slip deeper and deeper into their own confirmation biases, their own feedback loops, their own fantasies. This is one understanding of Freud's death drive, a return to the familiar, a rejection of growth, a turning away from the reality of the outside. If this patient were to journal, and he does journal, or seek self-knowledge, and he tries this through over-intellectual thinking, he would always come up with the same answers. The self and its patterns begets more selves and their patterns, grooves, feedback loops, etc. Sameness. This is because when one attempts to get outside of one's self, one always encounters more of one's old, stale self. And the old self says, why bother escaping yourself? You're okay, just keep doing what you're doing. Real growth has to some extent, come from another. If I had not asked these questions, can you ask your friend? Have you called back? This patient would have never thought of these questions, as his preconceived fantasies preclude or exclude the very thinking and feeling processes that would impel him to ask himself these questions. When I work with addicts at my hospital, they try to tell me all the right, try to speed through treatment by feeding me the right answers, try to rush things along. I tell them, you seem to accept treatment on your own terms, but to get better you need to accept treatment on someone else's terms. It's one thing to accept your own idea of reality, it's another thing to accept another person's idea, and it's a whole other thing to accept the reality of the idea of reality. This is the strength of the Lacanian approach of accepting the law of the analyst, accepting the real, the overbearing interpretation, the variable length session that terminates at the analyst's will. What Nick Land refers to as the real outside, throughout his career, as opposed to alterity in advance, in Kant, capital, and the prohibition of incest. In other words, without an analyst, another, and the psychoanalytic setting, you get the neurotic who finds out that in the end it was all just the other person's fault the whole time, the world's shortcomings. You get the Nazi, or paranoic, who finds out in the end it was the Jew or alien other the whole time. Sees Isaac's understanding of ideology and anti-Semitism in his first book Sublime Objective Ideology, the addict who chooses the bottle over something else, there, etc. etc. Another of thinking about this in less psychoanalytic terms. Cybernetically, the incentive towards self-reinforcing confirmation bias outweighs the incentive towards change. Epistemologically, we don't know what we don't know, and our lack of knowing what we don't know prevents us from seeking what we don't know. The analyst pulls one out of their loop by leveraging their loop, and can see what is missed and introduce it into the loop gently. This is after all the psychoanalytic object relations model, that a patient comes us with certain object impressions, schemas, and that the analyst is integrated slowly over time, loosening up schemas and objects. As I wrote in the minor science of canine epistemology, doggy psychiatry. As ethologists show, behavioral structures or stereotypes, schemas take in and sort out noise and signal over time, and thus develop more precise models and therefore more precise parameters for triggering a behavior. As developmental psychologists similarly show, a child learns dog, sees a dog, says dog, gets positive feedback from the parent. Next, a child sees a cat, says dog, and gets negative feedback from the parent. No, that is a cat. The child uses negative and positive reinforcement, or feedback, to modulate parameters, and learns to exclude the aspects pertaining to the cat model from the dog model. The dog model is now honed, and more precise. This process continues on and on until our internal working models are more and more precise and therefore better at mapping the outside. So, Analysis offers difference and outsideness through the vehicle of another's body.